am Mila Wilson. I am 38 years old, and the day I sat across from my crying mother with a $10,000 cashier check under my palm was the day I realized my entire family was a financial crime waiting to happen. We were sitting in a Coney Island diner off Michigan Avenue. She was sobbing about a ruthless Chicago hedge fund that had bought her apartment building and was threatening to evict her by Friday if she did not hand over a small fortune. I let her perform. I listened to her outline the corporate greed and her own impending homelessness. Then I slid the check slightly forward and asked her if she had submitted the broken radiator ticket on Tuesday or if Todd had done it for her. The tears stopped falling. The blood left her cheeks. I was never supposed to know about that radiator because I was the anonymous landlord who approved the repair order, and the eviction she was crying about was a total fabrication. If you have ever busted your back to support a family that treats you like a secondary character and a primary bank account, you belong here. Tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to Ariana Revenger to watch me dismantle a toxic family machine using nothing but their own paperwork. The neon sign in the diner window cast a red glow across the wet pavement of the street outside. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of griddle grease and chopped onions. I kept my hand flat on the speckled Formica table. The check beneath my palm was real. It represented a temptation for both of us. Brenda wore a tailored trench coat and held a crumpled paper napkin to her eyes. She painted a tragic picture of a helpless woman victimized by an unfeeling real estate conglomerate. She detailed the sudden rent hikes and the looming deadline before the sheriffs would arrive to throw her out into the cold. I waited. I watched the tears well up and spill with a practiced rhythm that I had seen her use on cashiers and mechanics and family members for decades. A tired waitress walked by and topped off my ceramic mug with bitter coffee. I did not interrupt my mother. I just studied the woman who had spent my entire life telling people I would never amount to anything. When she finally ran out of breath, she reached across the table for the check. I pressed my palm down harder on the paper. I kept my voice pitched just above the clatter of silverware from the open kitchen. I asked her about the radiator. Her hand hovered over the table. The silence between us grew heavy. She realized in a fraction of a second that the ruthless Chicago hedge fund did not exist, and the person sitting across from her held the deed to her building. To understand how a daughter ends up holding a ransom over her own mother in a downtown diner, you have to rewind 6 weeks. You have to look at the soil where this particular poison grew. I own a commercial supply chain logistics firm based just outside Detroit. I route freight across the Great Lakes. I manage vast warehouses filled with industrial components. I calculate load weights, and I negotiate hostile transport contracts with men who expect me to fold under pressure. I do not fold. The Michigan winters teach you a specific kind of resilience. I learned how to stand my ground early because I had no other choice. When I was 20 years old, I worked the graveyard shift on a freezing loading dock to pay for night classes. I wore thick canvas jackets and breathed in diesel exhaust, while my older sister Vanessa was up in Traverse City swirling Pinot Noir on our mother's dime. Vanessa was the elegant daughter. She was the one who received the funding and the praise and the soft landing pads. I was the forklift life. I was the blue-collar disappointment. My father was the only one who saw the value in the dirt under my fingernails. He understood the rhythm of a hard day of work. I remember sitting with him on the front porch after those grueling night shifts, watching the sun come up over the neighborhood. He would crack open cold cans of Werner's ginger ale and hand one to me. He used to look at my exhausted face and tell me I would always land on my feet. He died before I built my company, but he went out believing in my grit. He knew I was built for the concrete. Brenda just treated me like a clerical error. Let us look closer at that 20-year-old girl on the loading dock. She was not just learning how to operate heavy machinery, she was learning the architecture of survival. When an 18-wheeler backed into the bay, late on a January night with a frozen manifest, the driver did not care if I was tired. He only cared if I could solve the problem. I learned to read a room and evaluate leverage before speaking. I learned that the person who panics first loses the negotiation. That cold loading dock was my classroom. The skills I acquired there were an inheritance of grit passed down through the working-class veins of this city. It was not a gift from my family. It was a trade I mastered while they looked the other way. Vanessa never had to calculate leverage. Her path was paved with checks written by the same woman who told me I was too rough around the edges to succeed. Vanessa received the wine country tuition, the boutique business capital, the endless string of safety nets. Brenda poured her resources into the daughter who reflected her own aspirations of high society elegance. I was the dark stain on her pristine social calendar. Every time I showed up to a family event in work boots, I reminded her of the blue-collar reality she desperately wanted to escape. My Aunt Diane is a retired auto union representative. She spent her youth staring down executives from the major car manufacturers fighting for fair wages and safe conditions. She does not mince words, and she sees right through the polite fictions people tell themselves. A few years ago, she sat at my kitchen table and watched me pace the floor over another one of Brenda's casual cruelties. Diane stirred her black coffee and gave me a piece of truth that I brushed off at the time. She told me that winning an argument with my mother is not the same thing as winning my mother. I did not understand the difference back then. I spent the last 2 decades trying to prove Diane wrong. I built a logistics empire from the ground up, just to force the woman who called me useless to admit I amounted to something real. I wanted to place my success in front of her and force her to applaud. The sequence of events I'm about to lay out did not begin as a quest for justice. It did not start as a crusade to expose family fraud. It started with a quiet, embarrassing ache I would never admit in a boardroom. I engineered this entire collision because I wanted her to finally see me. I thought buying her building and securing her future would be the undeniable proof of my worth. I thought I could purchase the approval I had been craving since I was 12 years old. I was about to learn that love cannot be bought and betrayal does not care about your net worth. Sitting in the Coney Island diner all those years later, the contrast felt sharper than ever. I watched the grease pop on the grill behind the counter. I felt the vibration of a passing truck rattle the diner window. This was my world. It was unpretentious and grounded in tangible things. Brenda looked entirely out of place in her trench coat, holding her fake tears like a shield. She had summoned me here believing she could extract cash from the rough daughter to fund the elegant lie. I kept my hand on the cashier check. $10,000 is a significant sum of money. For me, it represents days of routed shipments and optimized supply chains. For her, it was just a number on a page to be demanded. The true conflict in this booth was not about the money at all. It was about the narrative. If I handed over the check, I would validate her story. I would become the obedient bank account, ensuring her continued comfort while remaining invisible. If I pulled the check away, I would become the villain in her carefully constructed tragedy. The question about the broken radiator ticket was the scalpel. It cut through the melodrama and severed the puppet strings she thought she was pulling. Her reaction was instantaneous. The performance fractured and the real woman peered out from the wreckage. A woman caught in a snare of her own making. We stared at each other across the Formica table. The noise of the diner faded into a low hum. My heart pounded a steady rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained an impassive mask. This is how you win a negotiation on the dock. You present the undeniable fact, and you let the silence do the heavy lifting. I watched her mind race, searching for an exit strategy that no longer existed. To comprehend the full weight of this moment, we must go back to a high-end steakhouse in Birmingham 6 weeks prior. We must revisit the dinner where the seed of this entire operation was planted and watch the dominoes begin to fall. 6 weeks before that showdown in the diner, I sat at a round table in a high-end Birmingham steakhouse, the kind of restaurant where the waiters sweep crumbs off the white linen with little silver blades, and the lighting is kept dim to hide the exorbitant prices on the menu. My mother sat at the center of the booth, holding a glass of Cabernet like a royal scepter. We were gathered for one of her mandatory family dinners. I wore a tailored blazer over a plain blouse, but to her I might as well have been wearing a high-visibility safety vest. Between delicate bites of her filet mignon, Brenda decided it was time to address my career. She leaned forward and sighed heavily, addressing my Aunt Diane and my sister Vanessa. "It is just such a blue-collar embarrassment," she lamented, swirling her dark wine. "Mila spends her days arguing with truck drivers and inhaling diesel fumes. I tell my friends she is in management, but they know. They see the dirt on her boots. Why she could not build something elegant like Vanessa is beyond my comprehension." Vanessa sat across from me wearing a silk top that cost more than my first car. She offered a modest, practiced smile. Vanessa runs a boutique cherry wine business up in Traverse City. In my mother's eyes, that winery is the pinnacle of sophistication. It represents the refined life Brenda always believed she deserved, but could never afford on my late father's factory wages. Vanessa murmured something polite about the logistics industry being essential, but her husband Todd chuckled. Todd wore pristine leather boat shoes in the middle of a Michigan march. He leaned back and adjusted his expensive watch, signaling his agreement with my mother. I focused on cutting my steak. I did not raise my voice or defend my operation. I did not tell them that my logistics firm had just secured a distribution contract that eclipsed their entire winery revenue for the decade. In my line of work, you let the other side underestimate you. It gives you the upper hand when the real negotiations begin. But sitting there at that table, I was not a chief executive. I was a daughter, hoping for a scrap of validation. When the waiter placed the leather check folder in the center of the table, Brenda seamlessly looked away. She began a very involved conversation with Vanessa about a new shade of lipstick. Todd suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating. The check sat there ignored by everyone who had ordered the most expensive items on the menu. I reached across the linen and pulled the folder toward me. The total was over $800. I slid my corporate card into the leather pocket. As I handed it back to the waiter, my fingers betrayed a slight tremor. I am careful with my facts, and I want to be honest about that tremor. I did not shake because of the money. I shook because a part of me, that persistent, hopeful kid, still believed that picking up the check might buy a kind word. I thought Brenda might look at me, acknowledge the gesture, and say thank you. She did not even glance my way. She just ordered another round of sparkling water. Over coffee, the conversation shifted to Brenda's latest tragedy. She clutched her cloth napkin and announced that the owner of her luxury Royal Oak apartment building was putting the property up for sale. She painted a grim picture of her future. Some faceless corporate conglomerate is going to swoop in and buy the place, she wept, looking directly at Vanessa for comfort. They will double the rent and throw me out on the street. I will be homeless by summer. She looked past me entirely. I watched her seek reassurance from the daughter whose business was perpetually struggling, while ignoring the daughter who routed millions of dollars of freight across the Midwest. I stirred my coffee and introduced a piece of information disguised as casual conversation. "You got a notice about a building sale?" I asked, keeping my tone light. You actually opened a piece of mail, Mom. I thought Todd handled all your paperwork now." Nobody at the table flinched. Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "Todd is a blessing," she said. "He intercepts all those confusing letters for me. I just forward everything to his office. He keeps me organized so I do not have to worry my head over legal jargon." Aunt Diane, who had been quietly destroying a slice of cheesecake, spoke up. She pointed her fork at Todd. "Speaking of your paperwork, Todd, that wine club invoice you sent me for Christmas looked awful. Diane does not care about social graces. She spent 30 years negotiating auto assembly contracts, and she can spot a bad bluff from a mile away. It looked cheap," she continued, "like a collection notice from a shady debt buyer. I almost threw it in the trash." Todd flushed a deep red. His arrogant smile faltered for a second. "It is a new billing software, Diane," he muttered, taking a quick sip of his drink. "Just working out the glitches in the template." Brenda steered the conversation back to her impending doom. She wiped a dry eye and sighed dramatically. If those corporate vultures kick me out of Royal Oak, at least I still have the cabin, she said, referencing her most prized possession. She was talking about the rustic property up in the Upper Peninsula. My grandfather built that cabin by hand in 1962. He hauled the timber himself and laid the stone foundation. It was the only thing Brenda owned, free and clear. I would never let strangers touch what my father built, she vowed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. It is our family legacy. It will stay in this family until the day I die. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I let the table murmur their agreement and offer their sympathies. What none of them knew was that my supply chain company had just posted its most profitable quarter in 10 years. My cash reserves were substantial. They also did not know that my real estate broker had called me 3 hours before this dinner. He confirmed that my anonymous limited liability company had placed the winning bid on Brenda's Royal Oak apartment building. The deal was already in the final stages of underwriting. The faceless corporate entity my mother feared was sitting right across from her, paying for her stake. The dinner ended with forced hugs and hollow promises to stay in touch. I walked to my car alone. The night air was biting and the wind off the lakes carried the promise of a late spring frost. I merged onto Interstate 75 heading south toward my warehouse district. The highway was nearly empty. I gripped the steering wheel and allowed myself to construct a plan. I decided I would formalize the purchase of the building. I would become her landlord. I would draft a new lease and lock her rent at its current rate for the next 5 years, protecting her from the shifting market. Then I would send the new lease via certified mail with a handwritten note attached. A gentle note. A note that simply said she was safe and her rent would not go up. I told myself I was doing it out of professional courtesy. I convinced myself that securing her housing was the responsible adult choice. I treated it like a logistical problem that required a practical solution. But driving down that dark stretch of asphalt, I knew I was lying to myself. It was not a business transaction. It was a bid for approval. I was executing a financial maneuver just to prove my worth to a woman who refused to see it. I operated under a persistent internal lie. I believed that if I won big enough, if I secured her life, she would finally turn around and recognize me. I thought the yellow, sticky note on the lease would be the key that unlocked the door to my mother. I parked at my facility and looked up at the floodlights illuminating the loading bays. The trucks were lined up ready for the morning routes. I had built an empire from nothing, but I was still trying to buy a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I sent the certified letter the following Monday. I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for the tearful apology. I waited for the moment everything would change. I had no idea that the letter would never reach her hands or that the silence that followed would expose a network of theft running right through the center of our family. I finalized the acquisition of the 6-unit apartment building through a newly formed limited liability company. In my industry, you learn quickly that loud money attracts liabilities while quiet wealth builds fortresses. The transition of ownership occurred without a single ripple in the local real estate market. The previous owner handed over the digital records and the physical tenant files. I sat at my heavy metal desk in the glass-walled office overlooking the main sorting floor of my distribution center. Forklifts whined and reversed in the cavernous space below me, but my focus remained locked on one specific manila folder. The name tab read Brenda Wilson. Handling my mother's file felt like holding a live wire. I opened the folder and reviewed her rental history. She had lived in that unit for 4 years. The previous management company had scheduled a standard rent increase for the upcoming renewal cycle. I struck that clause from the new contract. I drafted a revised lease agreement that locked her monthly rate exactly where it was for the next 5 years. I removed the standard annual hike and waived the new administrative fees. I wanted the document to be a fortress she could not ignore. Then came the hardest part of the morning. I pulled a square yellow sticky note from my drawer and picked up a pen. I stared at the blank yellow paper for a long time. I needed to write something that conveyed safety without sounding like a victor claiming the spoils. I did not want to trigger her defensive pride. I wrote a simple message. "You are safe here. It won't go up." I signed it with a single letter, M. I left off my full name deliberately. The single initial was soft. It was designed to open a door rather than announce a conquest. I clipped the yellow note to the signature page of the lease. I placed the entire packet into a thick cardboard envelope and printed a certified mail label. Sending it certified ensured that someone had to physically sign for the delivery. I handed the envelope to my outgoing courier, and I waited. I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for the tearful thaw. I imagined Brenda opening the envelope, recognizing my handwriting, and realizing the magnitude of what I had done. I pictured her picking up her phone and calling me to say she was wrong about me. I spent 3 days carrying my cell phone everywhere. I checked the screen during inventory meetings. I checked it while walking the loading docks. I checked it sitting in my quiet kitchen late at night. Instead of a breakthrough, I received silence. The quiet stretched out and turned brittle. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, my office phone buzzed. It was not my mother. It was Aunt Diane. Her voice came through the receiver tight and frantic. She skipped her usual greetings and launched straight into a panic. "Mila," she said, breathing hard. "Your mother just called me sobbing her eyes out. She is telling everyone a predatory Chicago hedge fund bought her building." I stopped reviewing the manifest on my screen. I asked Diane to slow down and tell me exactly what Brenda was saying. Diane repeated the story with the precision of a seasoned union negotiator. Brenda claimed this ruthless out-of-state firm had sent her a threatening letter. They were demanding she sign a new lease that doubled her rent by the end of the month. If she did not pay, they promised to evict her immediately. Brenda was telling the aunts and the cousins that she was going to be thrown out on the street. I sat at my metal desk, staring blindly at the warehouse floor below. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The narrative Diane recounted bore zero resemblance to the generous 5-year locked lease I had sent. It was a spectacular, terrifying fiction. I ended the call with Diane promising I would look into the situation. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the Postal Service tracking website. I typed in the certified mail tracking number from Brenda's envelope. The screen loaded and displayed the delivery confirmation. The package was marked "Delivered." It had been signed for at her address. I clicked the link to view the digital image of the signature. The scrawl on the screen was not Brenda's elegant cursive. It was a sharp looping letter T. Todd. The memory of the steakhouse dinner fired in my brain like a flare. I remembered the casual comment passing over the white linen. Todd handles her paperwork now. He intercepts all those confusing letters. My gentle yellow note never reached her. The 5-year locked lease, the promise of safety, the silent plea for her approval. None of it made it into her hands. The envelope had been intercepted before she could read a single word. For one vertiginous moment, 2 competing truths sat side by side in my office. The first truth was that my mother was a cruel manipulator, staging an eviction to fleece her family. The second truth was that my mother was a victim being actively lied to by the son-in-law she trusted above everyone else. That second possibility gutted me far more than any betrayal could. It meant the reconciliation I had carefully engineered was strangled in a mailbox. The olive branch was intercepted by a man wearing boat shoes in March. Brenda might actually believe she was being thrown out on the street. She might be sitting in her apartment right now, terrified of a fictional Chicago hedge fund, because Todd handed her a fabricated story instead of my lease. In the logistics industry, when a valuable shipment vanishes from a facility, you do not start screaming at the truck drivers. You do not send angry emails or make frantic phone calls. You walk into the security room and you pull the loading dock footage. You look at the raw data. You find the timestamps and you trace the movement of the freight. I forced myself to switch off the wounded daughter and switch on the chief executive. I closed the postal tracking tab. I opened the encrypted property management portal for my new real estate limited liability company. I navigated to the tenant ledger for Brenda Wilson. I needed to see the raw data of her residency. I needed to know if she was drowning or if she was floating. The screen populated with her financial history. I scanned the columns of dates and amounts. Brenda's rent was exactly $2,000 a month. The ledger showed no missed payments, no late fees, no outstanding balances. Her rent was paid on time in full every single month without fail. She was a perfect tenant on paper. I clicked deeper into the payment processing system. I wanted to see the origin of the funds. The portal displayed the electronic clearinghouse data for the most recent transaction. I looked at the routing number and the account name attached to the monthly rent draft. The bank account did not bear Brenda's name. The rent was being automatically drafted from a corporate checking account. The name on the account read Todd and Vanessa Enterprise. I leaned back in my desk chair and let the silence of my office settle around me. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with a harsh mechanical precision. Brenda was not struggling to pay her rent. She had not written a rent check in months. Todd was managing her housing payments directly from his own business account. If Todd controlled the rent payments and Todd intercepted the mail, then Brenda was operating entirely in the dark. She was not the mastermind behind this impending family crisis. She was the merchandise being moved across the board. Someone was running an elaborate financial scam, and they were using my mother as the freight. Todd knew the building had been sold because he intercepted the transition paperwork. He knew the rent was not doubling because he held the actual lease offering a 5-year freeze. Yet he was feeding Brenda a horror story about a predatory hedge fund and imminent eviction. He was winding her up and aiming her at the family. The question was no longer whether my mother was lying. The question was what Todd stood to gain by making an entire network of working-class relatives believe a 70-year-old woman was about to be rendered homeless. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. The time for seeking approval was over. It was time to audit the family. I spent the next 48 hours executing a quiet and meticulous audit of my family. I did not rely on internet searches or public records databases. When you want to uncover the financial health of an enterprise, you do not look at their marketing materials. You look at their supply chain. I started calling my contacts in the northern part of the state where the cherry orchards meet the wineries. Information in the logistics industry is currency, and people do not hand it over for free. I hit 2 frustrating dead ends before lunch on Monday. A regional bottling facility manager hung up on me the moment I mentioned Todd's name. A trucking dispatcher cited client confidentiality and refused to confirm any delivery schedules. The friction was real. I was burning through professional goodwill just to map the perimeter of the lie. I lost an entire day chasing shadows. On Tuesday morning, I finally located a major distributor who handled boutique wines in Traverse City. He was hesitant to talk. He owed Todd nothing, but he owed his own corporate compliance officers a clean record. I had to offer a trade. I guaranteed him a highly lucrative, expedited freight lead for his upcoming autumn harvest shipments in exchange for a candid conversation about Todd and Vanessa Enterprise. He took the deal. The intelligence he provided was not a gift. It was earned pay dirt. The distributor laid out the brutal truth. The boutique cherry wine business that my mother constantly praised as the pinnacle of elegance was a rotting corpse. They had not shipped a single case of wine in 3 months. The state regulatory board had pulled their liquor license due to a massive backlog of unpaid excise taxes. Furthermore, a crippling balloon payment on their specialized fermentation equipment was due in less than 10 days. If they missed the payment, the bank would seize the machinery and lock the doors of the facility. The manufactured crisis in Royal Oak suddenly snapped into sharp focus. The fake eviction story was never about securing my mother's housing. It was an elaborate cover designed to funnel the family GoFundMe donations directly into a dying winery. Todd was attempting to crowdsource his own bailout by terrifying a network of working-class relatives. He was draining their limited resources to preserve the illusion of Vanessa's golden success. As I dug deeper into the financial filings the distributor provided, I caught the first thread of the real story. It was a detail that complicated my entire understanding of the battlefield. I reviewed a copy of the equipment loan agreement that had triggered the impending balloon payment. The document required the signatures of both managing partners. I stared at the signature line belonging to Vanessa. I knew my sister's handwriting. I had watched her sign birthday cards and graduation gifts for decades. The signature on the loan document was fundamentally flawed. The slant was too rigid. The looping letters lacked her characteristic flair. It looked forced and mechanical. I remembered a recent text message exchange between Vanessa and a mutual cousin. The cousin had forwarded it to me weeks ago, complaining about Vanessa's erratic behavior. In the message, Vanessa vehemently denied authorizing any new debt for the winery. She swore she had explicitly refused to sign off on the equipment upgrades. The handwriting on the loan was off. The denial in the text message was frantic. The conclusion was chilling. Todd was not just lying to the family. He was likely forging his own wife's signature to secure commercial loans. The tidy hierarchy of villains I had constructed in my mind began to crumble. I had expected a simple structure of greed, a greedy sister demanding funds, a greedy mother enabling the theft, a greedy son-in-law executing the plan, but the reality refused to stay neat. If Todd was forging Vanessa's signature on federal loan documents, then the favored, effortless daughter was not a co-conspirator. She was another hostage in the machine. That evening, I attended a Detroit Tigers game at Comerica Park. It was a mandatory networking event for local logistics executives. I stood near the concession stands watching the crowd flow past while I processed the magnitude of Todd's deception. I was calculating my next move when a hand jabbed sharply into my shoulder. I turned around and found Todd standing there holding a plastic cup of beer. He wore his signature boat shoes and a smug expression. He had tracked me down at a public event to apply pressure. "You need to step up, Mila," he said, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "We have already raised $12,000 on the GoFundMe, but the deadline is Friday. You need to drop 10 grand into Mom's fund tonight. Do not be the greedy sister while the rest of us are bleeding to save her." I looked at the man who was actively trying to pickpocket an entire family to save his own fragile ego. He stood there cloaked in righteous indignation, demanding I hand over my capital to fund his fraud. I felt the steel jaws of the trap I was building grow warm under my hand. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in slightly and delivered my condition. "I need to see the eviction notice, Todd," I said calmly. "Send the official document to my email tonight. Once I have the paperwork, I will transfer the 10 grand. Todd smiled a wide, victorious smile. He thought he had successfully bullied the rich sister into submission. He thought the money was already his. He gave me a patronizing pat on the arm and swaggered off into the crowd, certain he had won the negotiation. I stayed in the stadium alone for the 7th inning stretch. The crowd roared as a player hit a double, but I barely registered the noise. I stood there turning over the ugly new question that had surfaced during my audit. I had spent my entire life resenting Vanessa. I resented the wine country tuition and the effortless grace and the constant barrage of maternal approval she received while I worked in the cold. I had viewed her as the enemy. But if Todd was forging her signature on ruinous commercial loans, she was as trapped in his financial nightmare as my mother was. My carefully planned revenge was aimed at a target that kept splitting into new and complicated factions. I wanted to expose the fraud and punish the perpetrators, but the lines between perpetrator and victim were blurring. I was preparing to detonate a bomb in the center of my family, and I suddenly realized the shrapnel might hit the sister I had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. I did not like how that felt. The clean satisfaction of righteous anger was gone, replaced by a murky, confusing sense of responsibility. I was the only person who saw the entire board. I held the deed to the building, and I held the proof of the forgery. I noted the uncomfortable shift in my own emotions. I filed the feeling away and prepared for the forged document to arrive. The trap was set, and Todd was about to send me the key. Todd delivered the document the very next morning. A sharp ping from my inbox signaled the arrival of an email with an attachment titled, "Urgent Eviction Notice." I opened the file on my large desktop monitor. It was a scanned PDF featuring aggressive, bold typography on official-looking letterhead for a company called Great Lakes Holdings, LLC. The text laid out a dire scenario. It demanded an immediate payment of $10,000 to halt impending eviction proceedings against Brenda Wilson. It cited fabricated lease violations and threatened immediate legal action if the funds were not wired by Friday. I leaned back in my chair and let out a short, harsh laugh. The sheer audacity of the forgery was momentarily amusing. Then my eyes drifted to the bottom of the page and the laughter died in my throat. The signature on the demand letter was not a random scribble. The printed name beneath the illegible scrawl read Arthur Sterling. Arthur Sterling is not a fictional property manager. He is my corporate attorney. He is the registered agent for the anonymous LLC I used to purchase Brenda's apartment building. The implication struck me with the force of a physical blow. The name Arthur Sterling was a matter of public record. It existed only on the state registry filings linking the property to my corporate structure. Todd had not just fabricated a random eviction notice. He had actively researched the ownership of the building. He had accessed the state database, found the name of the registered agent, and forged that specific name onto his fake demand letter. This realization changed the entire landscape of the conflict. Todd was not a clumsy grifter operating in the dark. He knew. He knew exactly who owned the building. He was not fooled by the anonymous LLC or the layers of corporate protection. He knew that the ruthless Chicago hedge fund was actually his sister-in-law sitting in a Detroit warehouse. If he knew I owned the building, then the fake eviction notice was not a desperate plea for help. It was a direct threat. He was betting that I would pay the $10,000 simply to maintain my anonymity. He was gambling that my fear of the family finding out I was the landlord collecting rent from my own mother would override my financial sense. He understood the family dynamics perfectly. If I refused to pay, he could easily reveal my ownership to the aunts and cousins. He could frame me as the greedy corporate landlord who callously watched her mother beg for GoFundMe donations while holding the deed to her apartment. The blackmail was precisely aimed at my deepest shame. It was aimed at the lingering insecurity of the blue-collar daughter who never felt she belonged. He calculated that I would gladly write a $10,000 check to bury the truth and protect my fragile standing in the family. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver. I had to respect the cold-blooded efficiency of the threat. But Todd made one critical miscalculation. He assumed I was still the 20-year-old girl desperate for a seat at the table. He did not realize he was negotiating with a woman who manages millions of dollars in hostile freight contracts. You do not win a negotiation by yielding to blackmail. You win by uncovering the opponent's critical vulnerability. I picked up my phone and called a close contact who works as a senior underwriter at a major title insurance firm in Detroit. I needed to look past the fake eviction and find the real financial hemorrhage. I asked her to run a quiet, expedited title search on a specific property located in the Upper Peninsula. I gave her the address of the rustic cabin my grandfather had built by hand in 1962. The same cabin Brenda had tearfully vowed would never be touched by strangers during that dinner at the Birmingham Steakhouse. It was the only asset Brenda owned outright, and it was the emotional anchor of our entire family history. My contact promised to have the report within the hour. I spent those 60 minutes pacing the floor of my office, watching the trucks load and unload on the docks below. When the encrypted file finally arrived in my inbox, I opened it with a creeping sense of dread. The title report was a map of financial devastation. 6 months ago, the public records showed a transfer of ownership. Brenda had signed a quitclaim deed legally adding Todd to the title of the cabin. 2 weeks after the quitclaim deed was recorded, a new lien appeared on the property. Todd, acting as a legal co-owner, had taken out a massive secondary mortgage against the cabin. He had extracted $150,000 of equity from the home my grandfather built. I stared at the screen, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The seed planted at the steakhouse dinner detonated in my mind. Brenda had proudly declared she would never let strangers touch the cabin. She was right. Strangers were not touching it. Her trusted son-in-law had already gutted it from the inside. I scrolled down to the terms of the secondary mortgage. The details provided by the title search revealed the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The loan was structured with a short-term balloon payment. That payment was due this coming Friday. If the balloon payment was missed, the lender would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. The property would be scheduled for a public foreclosure auction. The date for the auction was set for the very next day, Saturday morning. Suddenly, the sprawling, messy family drama collapsed into a razor-sharp timeline. The story now had a clock with teeth. I had exactly 72 hours to expose Todd, stop the wire fraud, and secure the necessary capital to halt the foreclosure. If I failed, the family would lose the one tangible piece of history that money could never rebuild. My grandfather's legacy would be auctioned off to the highest bidder because Todd needed cash to hide his failing winery. I looked at the forged eviction notice still open on my secondary monitor. Todd wanted $10,000 by Friday. The amount was likely just enough to cover the interest penalty and buy him a 30-day extension on the cabin mortgage. He was using the fake eviction to crowdsource the survival of his own fraudulent loan. I opened a blank email and addressed it to Todd. I did not confront him. I did not threaten him. I gave him exactly what he wanted to see: compliance. I typed a single line. This looks serious. Let us discuss the transfer of funds at Vanessa's charity dinner on Saturday. I hit send. I knew Saturday was the morning of the foreclosure auction. I was intentionally pushing the meeting past his critical deadline. Let him sweat. Let the pressure build. A desperate man makes mistakes, and I needed Todd to make a massive public error. Seconds after I sent the email, my cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID displayed Brenda's name. I answered the call. The voice on the other end was stripped of all its usual haughty pretense. The performance was gone. Mila, she whispered, her voice cracking with genuine terror. I need the $10,000. I need it by Friday. If I do not get that money, I lose everything. I listened to the raw panic in my mother's voice. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she was not lying. She was telling the absolute truth. She just did not comprehend the reality of her own words. She thought she was talking about losing a rented apartment in Royal Oak. She had no idea that everything actually meant the cabin, the family legacy, and the son-in-law she trusted above her own daughters. The clock was ticking, and the charity gala was approaching. The Save the Lakes charity gala took place on a frigid Saturday evening at a private yacht club on the shores of Lake St. Clair. The event was billed as a fundraiser for ecological preservation. In reality, it was a thinly veiled theatrical production designed to beg local investors for cash to keep Todd and Vanessa afloat. The yacht club featured vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the dark, churning water. Inside of the room smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted prime rib. A string quartet played classical music in the corner, trying to mask the desperation hanging in the air. I arrived wearing a simple tailored black dress. I have never felt the need to wear my net worth on my sleeve. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a tall potted palm where I could observe the room. I was not there to socialize. I was there to conduct a final assessment of a collapsing structure. My eyes found Vanessa immediately. She glided through the crowd wearing a floor-length sequined gown she could not possibly afford. Growing up, Vanessa was the undisputed pageant queen of our household. She was the golden child who moved with an effortless grace that our mother constantly weaponized against me. I used to look at my own calloused hands and feel a profound sense of inadequacy next to her polished perfection. I spent my youth believing Vanessa had drawn the winning ticket in the lottery of our family. Tonight I watched her closely. I watched her the way you study a person you have suddenly realized might not be your enemy. The grace was still there, but the effortlessness was gone. Her shoulders were rigid. She gripped the stem of her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were white. Todd stood beside her wearing a velvet dinner jacket and working the crowd with a practiced smile. He leaned in to whisper something to a potential investor and placed his hand on the small of Vanessa's back. I saw it clearly from across the room. Vanessa flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but it spoke volumes. Her spine stiffened and her smile fractured for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. Todd tightened his grip, steering her toward another group of wealthy attendees. He was maneuvering her like a prized asset on a display floor. The Golden Sister was presenting a flawless facade to the world, but up close, the paint was peeling. I shifted my gaze toward the center of the room. Brenda had stationed herself near a towering swan ice sculpture. She was surrounded by a cluster of affluent guests who were listening to her with rapt attention. My mother was performing her Eviction tragedy, and she was executing it flawlessly. She wore a tasteful dark shawl and dabbed the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She recounted the cruelty of the fictional Chicago hedge fund that had purchased her building. She spoke of the sudden exorbitant rent demands and the terrifying prospect of losing her home. Her tears were genuine. That was the most unsettling part of the performance. Brenda truly believed every word she was saying. Todd had handed her a script of pure fiction, and she was delivering it with the raw emotion of a terrified victim. She was hunting for sympathy, and she was finding it. Guests murmured their condolences and threw angry glances at the abstract concept of corporate greed. Then the disaster I had not planned for materialized at the mahogany bar. I recognized the man ordering a martini immediately. He was the commercial real estate broker who had facilitated the sale of the Royal Oak apartment building to my anonymous logistics corporation. He was a notoriously chatty man who prided himself on knowing everyone in the Detroit property market. He knew the building had changed hands. More importantly, he knew that Mila Wilson was the ultimate buyer, and he knew that Brenda Wilson was the tenant residing in Unit 4. I watched in mounting horror as Brenda finished her story near the ice sculpture and began drifting across the carpeted floor. She was seeking a fresh audience for her tragedy, and she was heading directly toward the bar. The broker turned around with his drink in hand. He recognized Brenda. A smile of recognition spread across his face. Todd was standing only a few yards away, mingling with a city councilman, but keeping a watchful eye on his mother-in-law. If the broker greeted Brenda and casually mentioned my name, the entire operation would detonate. If he offered his sympathies and said he was surprised my company was raising her rent, the lie would unravel in the worst possible way. Todd would instantly realize that I owned the building and that I knew the eviction notice was a forgery. He would know I possessed the evidence to send him to federal prison. The leverage I needed to save my grandfather's cabin and secure the wire fraud trail would vanish into thin air. I had to intercept them. I set my water glass on a passing tray and began moving rapidly through the crowded room. The direct path to the bar was blocked by a dense crowd of donors waiting for appetizers. I was forced to take a narrow detour down a dim hallway that led past the coat check and the restrooms. The music from the string quartet was muffled here, replaced by the heavy thud of the kitchen doors swinging open and shut. As I hurried past the coat check counter, I heard a frantic, hushed voice echoing from the alcove. I slowed my pace and stepped into the shadow of a velvet curtain. Vanessa was standing in the alcove, clutching her cell phone to her ear. She was hunched over her sequined gown, pulling around her designer heels. Her free hand was gripping her forehead in a posture of pure despair. "I cannot sign anything else," she whispered fiercely into the receiver. Her voice was trembling with suppressed panic. "I told you I will not do it. You have to stop." Before the person on the other end could reply, the heavy mahogany door at the end of the hall swung open. Todd stepped into the corridor. His polished smile vanished the moment he saw his wife hiding in the alcove. "Who are you talking to?" he demanded. His tone was low and sharp. Vanessa snapped to attention. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. She ended the call and shoved the phone into her sequined clutch. She pasted a bright, empty smile onto her face. "It is just the caterer," she said, her voice pitching up half an octave. "They had a question about the dessert plating." Todd stared at her for a long, silent moment. He stepped into her personal space, closing the distance until she was backed against the coat check counter. He reached out and adjusted the strap of her gown. His movements were slow and deliberate. "We need to go back out there," he said softly. "We have investors waiting. Do not disappear again." He placed his hand on the small of her back and steered her out of the hallway. Vanessa walked beside him, her spine rigid, her eyes fixed straight ahead. I remained hidden in the shadows, processing the reality of what I had just witnessed. The twist I had suspected during my supply chain audit tightened into a suffocating knot. The Golden Sister was not the architect of the financial ruin. She was another hostage in the machine. Todd was driving the fraud, and Vanessa was trapped in the passenger seat, unable to stop the vehicle. My lifelong grievance began to curdle into something far more disorienting than anger. For 38 years, I had harbored a deep resentment because my mother chose Vanessa. I believe Vanessa had been handed the world while I was left to fight for scraps on a loading dock. But standing in that dim corridor, I realized the bitter truth of our family dynamic. Brenda had used Vanessa as a proxy for her own unfulfilled dreams of high society elegance. Todd was currently using Vanessa as a human shield to protect his failing business and his mounting debts. We were both just useful to different people in different ways. I was the financial safety net they tried to exploit, and she was the shiny ornament they used to attract capital. Neither of us had ever been seen for who we truly were. I filed the revelation away in my mind. There would be time to unpack the emotional wreckage later. Right now, the clock was ticking, and my carefully constructed plan was seconds away from a catastrophic failure. I stepped out of the alcove and accelerated my pace toward the main ballroom. I emerged from the hallway just as Brenda reached the mahogany bar. The commercial broker took a step toward her, raising his martini glass in a cheerful greeting. He opened his mouth to speak. Todd was turning his head toward the bar, tracking Brenda's movements. They were 3 feet apart. My entire strategy, my grandfather's cabin, and the safety of the working-class relatives who had been robbed hung in the balance. The trap I had spent 6 weeks building was one friendly hello from total collapse. I surged forward through the crowd, reaching out my hand. I closed the final distance to the mahogany bar just as the commercial broker drew breath to speak. I did not hesitate. I looped my arm firmly through Brenda's right elbow and pulled her sharply toward me, interrupting her forward momentum. "Mom," I said, injecting a note of breathless urgency into my voice. "Aunt Diane needs you out on the patio right now. It is an emergency with the caterers." Brenda startled, blinking at me in confusion. The broker paused his martini glass, hovering near his chin. He looked from me to Brenda, processing the sudden interruption. Before he could recalibrate his greeting and say my name, I spun my mother around. I steered her forcefully away from the bar and toward the heavy glass doors leading to the exterior deck. I did not look back to see if Todd had noticed the interception. I focused entirely on navigating through the clusters of wealthy donors. When we breached the patio doors, the freezing wind off Lake St. Clair hit us like a physical blow. Brenda shivered, pulling her dark shawl tighter across her shoulders. "What on earth is the matter with Diane?" she demanded, irritated by the sudden change in temperature. "We were having such a lovely conversation inside." I released her arm and smoothed the front of my black dress. "False alarm," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I misheard a waiter." "Diane is fine. You can go back inside." Brenda shot me a look of pure annoyance. She muttered something about my lack of social grace and hurried back into the warmth of the ballroom, eager to resume her tragic performance. I remained on the freezing balcony alone. The crisis at the bar was averted, but the near miss taught me a valuable lesson. Operating in the shadows was becoming too dangerous. The variables were multiplying, and the risk of accidental exposure was too high. If a chatty broker could unravel my investigation with a single sentence, I needed to control the narrative before someone else did. I had to stop hiding from the conflict and start directing it. I pulled my cell phone from my clutch and opened the encrypted property management application. I navigated to the financial dashboard. I needed to see the current damage report. I accessed the link to the Save Mom's Home fundraising campaign that Todd had launched. The screen loaded, and the numbers glowed stark white against the dark interface. The campaign total had reached $40,000. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, heavy sickness settle into my stomach. $40,000. That money did not come from anonymous, wealthy donors. It came from aunts and uncles who worked 30 years on the assembly lines at the Ford and General Motors plants. It came from cousins who pulled double shifts at local diners and auto parts supply stores. Relatives who lived paycheck to paycheck had emptied their meager savings accounts to save a woman whose rent was already paid in full. I clicked over to the tenant ledger for Unit 4. I reviewed the cleared checks one more time to cement the reality in my mind. Every single rent payment for the past 6 months had been drafted from a commercial checking account registered to Todd and Vanessa Enterprise. Todd controlled Brenda's housing. He controlled her mail. He controlled the flow of information into her apartment. He had orchestrated a massive theft against working-class people, using his mother-in-law as the sympathetic face of the operation. I needed an undeniable piece of evidence to link Todd directly to the extortion. The forged eviction notice was strong, but I needed proof of his intent. I needed him to articulate his demand in his own words, on his own device. I formulated a new strategy. Rather than confront him with accusations, I would let him believe his manipulation was succeeding. I would plan a decoy. I opened a new text message addressed to Todd. I spent a full minute crafting the language. I needed to sound exactly like the guilty, wealthy sister softening under the weight of family pressure. I needed to sound like I was cracking. I typed the message slowly. The gala tonight really opened my eyes, Todd. Seeing Mom so frightened breaks my heart. Maybe family does come before pride after all. I am thinking about how I can help resolve this mess with the building. Let us talk tomorrow. I hit send. It was pure bait cast directly into the dark water. I leaned against the freezing metal railing of the balcony and watched the dark waves of the lake crash against the seawall. The wind howled, tearing at the edges of my dress, but I did not feel the cold. I waited. Todd is a man driven by arrogance and impatience. He operates on the belief that everyone around him is slightly slower, slightly less cunning than he is. He saw an opening, and he lunged for it. Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated against the metal railing. It was a reply from Todd. I opened the message and read the text glowing on the screen. I am glad you are finally seeing reason, Mila. Here is the deal. You transfer the deed of the Royal Oak building into the family trust by Monday. If you sign the property, over this whole eviction problem goes away. If you refuse, I will make sure everyone in the family knows what you really are. You will be the greedy corporate landlord who threw her own mother on the street. Do not test me. I read the text twice. It was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. He had just transmitted a written demand for a multi-million-dollar real estate asset, accompanied by an explicit threat to ruin my reputation if I did not comply. He had committed felony extortion and blackmail using his own cellular device. I took a screenshot of the message. I uploaded the image file directly into the secure evidence folder on my cloud drive. It dropped into place right next to the forged eviction notice from Great Lakes Holdings, LLC, and the title search confirming the fraudulent secondary mortgage on my grandfather's cabin. The trap was now fully loaded and armed. I had the means, the motive, and the undeniable proof. I pocketed my phone and turned to look through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the yacht club. The string quartet was playing a lively waltz. The ballroom was bathed in warm, golden light. I watched my family moving across the polished dance floor. I saw Todd laughing, throwing his head back and slapping a local politician on the shoulder. I saw Vanessa standing rigidly by his side, her sequined dress sparkling under the chandeliers, her smile tight and unyielding. And I saw my mother. Brenda was seated at a corner table holding a fresh tissue. She looked genuinely exhausted, genuinely afraid. The performance had drained her. She was a woman staring down the barrel of homelessness, believing every word of the fictional nightmare her son-in-law had spun for her. She trusted Todd completely. She believed he was the blessing shielding her from a hostile world, while he was the one actively bleeding her dry and selling the roof over her head. I stood on the freezing balcony and felt a profound, hollow silence settle inside me. There was no surge of triumph. There was no adrenaline rush of a victorious strategist. I had just secured the evidence to dismantle the man destroying my family, but the victory tasted like ash. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was useless, the mother I had spent 20 years trying to impress, was currently terrified of a monster that did not exist while serving as the primary victim for the monster sitting next to her. I stayed out on the cold deck long after I had what I needed. I watched them dance through the thick glass, unable to push the heavy mahogany doors open and step back inside. The music played on, oblivious to the wreckage. Tomorrow the audit would conclude and the confrontation would begin. Sunday morning broke gray and bitterly cold over Detroit. The sky hung low like a bruised ceiling, promising sleet by the afternoon. I sat alone at my large granite kitchen island with a legal pad, a black pen, and a mug of strong coffee. The silence of the house was absolute, contrasting sharply with the chaotic noise of the yacht club gala the night before. I spread the printed documents across the stone surface, organizing the evidence into chronological order. I was no longer an observer. I was charting the exact architecture of a financial collapse. I drew a heavy line down the center of the legal pad. On the left side, I mapped the visible crisis. The forged eviction notice from Great Lakes Holdings, LLC, demanding $10,000 by Friday. The family fundraising campaign that had already amassed $40,000 in stolen pledges. The theatrical panic Brenda exhibited at every gathering. On the right side, I mapped the hidden machinery driving the crisis. Todd was not merely constructing a fake eviction to hide the bankruptcy of his boutique winery. He was operating as the central puppet master for the entire family. He controlled Brenda's mail and intercepted her correspondence. He managed her banking and paid her rent from his own corporate accounts, ensuring she remained completely reliant on his narrative. He had forged Vanessa's signature on federal equipment loans, binding his wife to a failing enterprise without her consent. And the most devastating maneuver of all, he had engineered a fraudulent quitclaim deed to seize control of my grandfather's cabin in the Upper Peninsula. He extracted $150,000 in equity, and the balloon payment on that ruinous secondary mortgage was due this coming Friday. Every single thread of the scam converged on the same Friday deadline. The machine was designed to extract maximum capital just before the entire structure collapsed. I needed to secure irrefutable proof of the cabin's compromised title. I could not rely solely on the digital report my contact had provided. I needed certified stamped copies from the county government. I left my house and drove to the county recorder's office in downtown Detroit. I am an executive who moves millions of dollars of freight, but I do not possess a magic wand that bypasses bureaucratic red tape. The process was grueling. I stood in line at 3 different offices. I filled out endless request forms in triplicate. The specific notary public who needed to authenticate the historical deed transfers was out sick until noon. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the municipal building for 3 hours drinking terrible vending machine coffee, waiting for a signature. The friction was intentional and necessary. Building an airtight legal case requires patience and a willingness to endure the grinding gears of the system. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked out of the municipal building clutching a thick manila envelope containing the certified quitclaim deed and the recorded secondary mortgage. The documents bore the official county seals. The proof was now bulletproof. I returned to my kitchen island and placed the certified envelope on top of the pile. I sat on the bar stool and stared at the collected evidence. The trap was fully constructed, but a heavy, suffocating doubt began to rise in my chest. I picked up my pen and forced myself to write the uncomfortable question at the top of the legal pad. What am I actually doing this for? The logical answer was simple. Exposing Todd stops a felony. It protects the working-class relatives who emptied their savings accounts to fund a lie. It prevents the bank from foreclosing on the cabin my grandfather built by hand. It neutralizes a threat. But the emotional answer, the answer buried beneath 2 decades of resentment, was far more complicated. Dropping this manila folder onto a family dinner table would detonate the world as Brenda knew it. It would obliterate the illusion of her golden son-in-law and expose the reality that her favored, elegant daughter was trapped in a financial nightmare. It would publicly demonstrate that she had been foolishly manipulated, while the blue-collar daughter she constantly belittled was the only one holding the safety net. Presenting this evidence would not make Brenda love me. It would likely make her hate me more. It would provide undeniable proof that the useless child was circling the family like a vulture waiting to expose their failures. She would view my intervention not as a rescue, but as an ultimate, humiliating conquest. For a long, tense moment, sitting in the quiet of my kitchen, I considered a much colder, simpler option. I had the capital. I could easily wire the $10,000 to Todd's fake management company and silence the immediate eviction threat. I could quietly contact the commercial lender holding the mortgage on the cabin and pay off the balloon payment myself, remaining entirely anonymous. I could let Todd walk away believing he had successfully extorted the rich sister. I could keep the peace, maintain the family illusion, and never force the ugly reckoning. If I simply paid the ransom, I could buy the appearance of being the good daughter. I could secure my mother's housing and save her prized possession without ever making her face the humiliation of her own gullibility. That was the lie whispering in my ear. The same lie I had carried since I was 12 years old. The lie that insisted I must win her approval at any cost, even if it meant funding the people who were actively destroying her. The lie told me that absorbing the financial blow in secret was a noble sacrifice. I stared at the pen in my hand. I thought about the sweat equity my grandfather poured into that cabin. I thought about my cousin Sarah skipping groceries to pledge $200 she desperately needed for her own children. I placed the pen down on the granite counter. The sharp click echoed in the empty kitchen. I was done paying the ransom for a seat at a table that did not exist. My cell phone buzzed violently against the legal pad, breaking the silence. The caller ID displayed Brenda's name. I answered the call, preparing myself for another dramatic performance. But the voice that came through the speaker was stripped entirely of its usual haughty pretense. The theatrical vibrato was gone. The performance had shattered. "Mila," she whispered. Her voice was thin, raw, and trembling with genuine terror. "I need $10,000. I need it by Friday. If I do not get that money, I lose everything." I listened to the ragged edge of her panic. She was not acting. The fear vibrating through the cellular connection was absolute. She truly believed she was standing on the precipice of homelessness. She truly believed that a faceless Chicago corporation was about to cast her out onto the freezing Michigan streets. Underneath the fear, I heard the devastating reality of her situation. She was a mother pleading for her survival, unaware that the man she trusted to protect her had already sold her father's cabin out from under her. She had no idea that the everything she feared losing had already been stolen. The grievance I had carried for 20 years, the bitter resentment of the overlooked child, did not vanish. But sitting in my kitchen, listening to her weep, the anger shifted, making room for something colder and far more urgent. She did not need a daughter trying to win her affection. She needed an executive capable of stopping a hemorrhage. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting the calm authority I use during a warehouse crisis. "I hear you, Mom," I said. "I will meet you tomorrow. We can discuss the transfer of funds." "Oh, thank God, Mila," she sobbed, the relief crashing through her words. "Thank you. We can meet at the steakhouse in Birmingham for lunch. I will make a reservation." "No," I replied, cutting her off smoothly. "Not the steakhouse. I will meet you at the Coney Island Diner on Michigan Avenue, 1 o'clock. Bring the eviction notice." I ended the call before she could argue the location. I was not going to meet her in a dimly lit, fine dining establishment where she could perform for the waitstaff and hide behind expensive linens. I chose the diner because the smell of chili dogs and raw onions makes pretension impossible. I chose the harsh, fluorescent lighting because it leaves no shadows for lies to hide in. I gathered the documents on the island and slid them into a leather briefcase. Neither of us knew it yet, but the meeting at the Coney Island Diner would mark the exact moment I finally stopped trying to win her approval and started trying to save the only things that actually mattered. The audit was complete. The trap was set. Tomorrow the extraction begins. The neon sign in the window of the Coney Island Diner buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting a red glare across the wet pavement of Michigan Avenue. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hot griddles, frying onions, and the harsh, sterile scent of industrial floor cleaner. I sat in the cracked red vinyl booth, my hands resting flat on the speckled Formica table. This brings us back to the moment where the story began. But now the scene is loaded with the heavy, silent weight of everything I know and everything Brenda is about to discover. The door of the diner chimed. Brenda walked in looking entirely out of place among the truckers and line workers grabbing a quick lunch. She wore her tailored trench coat, belted tightly at the waist, her hair perfectly styled despite the freezing rain outside. She clutched her expensive designer purse against her side like a shield. She spotted me in the corner booth and hurried over, sliding into the vinyl seat across from me. She looked genuinely frayed. The polished veneer she presented at the country club was cracking at the edges. She did not waste time with greetings or small talk. She immediately launched into the rehearsed plea about the ruthless Chicago hedge fund. She wept, describing the sudden exorbitant rent demands and the looming Friday deadline before the sheriffs would arrive to throw her belongings onto the street. She painted a picture of absolute corporate cruelty targeting a helpless widow. I let her talk. I let her run through the entire performance, watching the tears well up and spill with a practiced rhythm. I let a tired waitress slide by and drop off a ceramic mug of black coffee. I did not interrupt. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer. I withdrew a certified cashier's check for $10,000. I placed it face down on the Formica table and covered it entirely with my palm. The check was real. It was cashable immediately. It represented a genuine temptation for both of us. For her, it was salvation from a manufactured nightmare. For me, it was the final opportunity to buy the illusion of being the dutiful, beloved daughter. I kept my palm pressed firmly against the paper. "I will hand this over right now, Mom," I said. My voice pitched just above the clatter of silverware from the open kitchen, but I need to see the official demand letter from the landlord first. My accountant requires a copy of the eviction notice for the wire transfer documentation. Brenda did not hesitate, the panic overriding her usual caution. She unzipped her designer purse and fumbled inside, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the table and pushed it toward me. It was the forged document Todd had created. The aggressive, bold typography on the fake Great Lakes Holdings LLC letterhead glaring up at me. I looked at the document. I looked at the forged signature of my corporate attorney scrawled at the bottom of the page. I tapped the fake signature twice with my index finger. I kept my voice perfectly even, gentle even. "Did you submit the broken radiator ticket on Tuesday, Mom?" I asked, "or did Todd submit it for you?" Her hand stopped halfway across the table. The tears vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden chilling stillness. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale beneath the diner's fluorescent lights. She stared at me, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying comprehension. "How do you know about the radiator?" She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the neon sign. She was never supposed to know that I knew about the radiator. No one in the family knew. The maintenance portal was secure. The only people who knew about the repair request were the tenant who submitted it and the anonymous landlord who approved the work order. The invisible wall between us cracked right down the middle. "You," she whispered, and the word carried no venom. It carried pure vertigo, a sudden terrifying reorientation of her entire reality. "You bought the building." I nodded slowly, keeping my hand on the $10,000 check. "I did, Mom. I bought it last month, and I sent you a new lease via certified mail." I clipped a yellow sticky note to the signature page. It said you were safe and your rent would not go up. I paused, letting the reality of the intercepted mail hang in the air between us. "You never got that note, did you?" The scene refused to play out as a tidy, triumphant victory. I did not scream at her. I did not gloat over catching her in a lie. I watched the fight leave her body entirely. Brenda seemed to shrink into the cracked vinyl of the booth. The commanding matriarch who dictated family dinners and criticized my boots evaporated, leaving behind a very tired, very frightened older woman. She shook her head slowly, staring at her hands resting on the formica. "I never saw a note, Mila," she admitted, her voice hollow. "Todd intercepted the transition packet. He told me the corporate buyer was hostile. He said they were a predatory fund from Chicago, intent on clearing out the current tenants to renovate and flip the units." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a different kind of tears now, tears of profound humiliation. "Todd said the family could quietly raise the money to cover the new deposit. He promised he would handle the negotiations so no one in the family needed to be shamed by an eviction. He told me he was protecting me." She had believed a monster because the monster was inside the family circle, and I had always been positioned outside of it. She trusted the man wearing boat shoes and drinking fine wine over the daughter managing freight schedules because he spoke the language she valued. I slid the forged eviction notice back across the table toward her. "Todd did not negotiate anything." "Mom," I said softly, "Todd created this document. He forged the signature of my corporate attorney. He generated this crisis to steal $40,000 from the family GoFundMe. Your rent is exactly $2,000, and it has been paid on time every month from a corporate account Todd controls. He is using you as the sympathetic face to crowdsource a bailout for his failing winery." Brenda closed her eyes. A silent sob racked her shoulders. She did not argue the facts. The truth was too heavy, too precise to deny. She reached out and touched the edge of the forged paper. Then she delivered a gut punch that fundamentally reframed my understanding of my entire life. "I let him handle everything, Mila," she whispered, her voice thick with grief. "I let him take over the mail and the accounts because Vanessa needed protecting. The winery is drowning. Her marriage is drowning. I thought if I gave Todd control, he would fix it and keep her safe." She opened her eyes and looked directly at me. The condescension was gone, replaced by a stark, agonizing honesty. "You never needed me, Mila. You were on a loading dock at 20 years old, fighting grown men over contracts. You were always so hard, so capable. I knew you would survive anything the world threw at you. Vanessa is fragile. If she falls, she shatters. I poured everything into her because I thought you were already built of iron. You were always fine." I sat back in the booth and let the words land. There it was. The ugly, warped truth laid bare in a Coney Island diner. Her blatant favoritism, her constant dismissal of my achievements, her harsh critiques of my blue-collar life. It was not born of pure cruelty. It was born of a mother's twisted triage. She loved me by neglecting me. She abandoned me to the cold because she was absolutely certain I would figure out how to build a fire. She funneled all her resources and all her warmth to the daughter she believed was too weak to survive the winter. It was still a deep, festering wound, Knowing the mechanism of the injury did not erase the 20 years of pain. It did not excuse the fact that she had treated me like a utility while treating my sister like a treasure. But sitting across from her, listening to the hum of the diner, I finally understood the shape of the damage. Understanding the shape of the wound is the beginning of healing. I had spent 2 decades trying to prove I was worthy of the warmth she was hoarding for Vanessa. I had built a logistics empire to buy a ticket to a show that had sold out years ago. I picked up the cashier's check and slid it back into my breast pocket. The transaction was canceled. I did not need to buy her approval anymore because the currency I was using had no value in her economy. The truth I had been running from finally caught up to me. I was fine. I had survived. I had built a fortress. And now the fragile sister she sacrificed everything to protect was trapped in a burning building with a man holding the matches. I looked at Brenda. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold executive focus. Exposing the forged eviction notice was no longer enough. The scope of the crisis had expanded. "We are leaving this diner, Mom," I said, sliding out of the booth. "We have a lot of work to do before Friday, and I need you to show me every document Todd asked you to sign in the last 6 months." Brenda nodded meekly, gathering her coat. She was no longer the matriarch directing the family. She was a tenant following the instructions of her landlord. The dynamic had permanently shifted, and the real extraction was about to begin. The neon sign in the window of the Coney Island diner buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting a red glare across the wet pavement of Michigan Avenue. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hot griddles frying onions and the harsh, sterile scent of industrial floor cleaner. I sat in the cracked red vinyl booth, my hands resting flat on the speckled Formica table. This brings us back to the moment where the story began. But now the scene is loaded with the heavy, silent weight of everything I know and everything Brenda is about to discover. The door of the diner chimed. Brenda walked in, looking entirely out of place among the truckers and line workers grabbing a quick lunch. She wore her tailored trench coat, belted tightly at the waist, her hair perfectly styled despite the freezing rain outside. She clutched her expensive designer purse against her side like a shield. She spotted me in the corner booth and hurried over, sliding into the vinyl seat across from me. She looked genuinely frayed. The polished veneer she presented at the country club was cracking at the edges. She did not waste time with greetings or small talk. She immediately launched into the rehearsed plea about the ruthless Chicago hedge fund. She wept, describing the sudden exorbitant rent demands and the looming Friday deadline before the sheriffs would arrive to throw her belongings onto the street. She painted a picture of corporate cruelty targeting a helpless widow. I let her talk. I let her run through the entire performance, watching the tears well up and spill with a practiced rhythm. I let a tired waitress slide by and drop off a ceramic mug of black coffee. I did not interrupt. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer. I withdrew a certified cashier's check for $10,000. I placed it face down on the Formica table and covered it entirely with my palm. The check was real. It was cashable immediately. It represented a genuine temptation for both of us. For her, it was salvation from a manufactured nightmare. For me, it was the final opportunity to buy the illusion of being the dutiful, beloved daughter. I kept my palm pressed firmly against the paper. "I will hand this over right now, Mom," I said, my voice pitched just above the clatter of silverware from the open kitchen. "But I need to see the official demand letter from the landlord first. My accountant requires a copy of the eviction notice for the wire transfer documentation." Brenda did not hesitate, the panic overriding her usual caution. She unzipped her designer purse and fumbled inside, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the table and pushed it toward me. It was the forged document Todd had created. The aggressive bold typography on the fake Great Lakes Holdings LLC letterhead glaring up at me. I looked at the document. I looked at the forged signature of my corporate attorney scrawled at the bottom of the page. I tapped the fake signature twice with my index finger. I kept my voice perfectly even, gentle even. "Did you submit the broken radiator ticket on Tuesday, Mom?" I asked. "Or did Todd submit it for you?" Her hand stopped halfway across the table. The tears vanished, instantly replaced by a sudden, chilling stillness. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale beneath the diner's fluorescent lights. She stared at me, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying comprehension. "How do you know about the radiator?" She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the neon sign. She was never supposed to know that I knew about the radiator. No one in the family knew. The maintenance portal was secure. The only people who knew about the repair request were the tenant who submitted it and the anonymous landlord who approved the work order. The invisible wall between us cracked right down the middle. "You," she whispered, and the word carried no venom. It carried pure vertigo, a sudden terrifying reorientation of her entire reality. "You bought the building." I nodded slowly, keeping my hand on the $10,000 check. "I did, Mom. I bought it last month. And I sent you a new lease via certified mail." I clipped a yellow sticky note to the signature page. It said you were safe and your rent would not go up. I paused, letting the reality of the intercepted mail hang in the air between us. "You never got that note, did you?" The scene refused to play out as a tidy, triumphant victory. I did not scream at her. I did not gloat over catching her in a lie. I watched the fight leave her body entirely. Brenda seemed to shrink into the cracked vinyl of the booth. The commanding matriarch who dictated family dinners and criticized my boots evaporated, leaving behind a very tired, very frightened older woman. She shook her head slowly, staring at her hands resting on the formica. "I never saw a note, Mila," she admitted, her voice hollow. "Todd intercepted the transition packet. He told me the corporate buyer was hostile. He said they were a predatory fund from Chicago intent on clearing out the current tenants to renovate and flip the units." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a different kind of tears now. Tears of profound humiliation. "Todd said the family could quietly raise the money to cover the new deposit. He promised he would handle the negotiations so no one in the family needed to be shamed by an eviction. He told me he was protecting me." She had believed a monster because the monster was inside the family circle, and I had always been positioned outside of it. She trusted the man wearing boat shoes and drinking fine wine over the daughter managing freight schedules because he spoke the language she valued. I slid the forged eviction notice back across the table toward her. "Todd did not negotiate anything, Mom," I said softly. "Todd created this document. He forged the signature of my corporate attorney. He generated this crisis to steal $40,000 from the family GoFundMe. Your rent is exactly $2,000, and it has been paid on time every month from a corporate account Todd controls. He is using you as the sympathetic face to crowdsource a bailout for his failing winery." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the certified county records. I placed the documents on the table next to the forged notice. I slid them toward her, tapping the official seal embossed on the top page. I told her to read the title search for the property in the Upper Peninsula. I told her to look at the paperwork for the cabin her father built by hand. Brenda hesitated. Her hands hovered over the pages before she finally picked them up. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the legal jargon. I watched her read the quitclaim deed, transferring partial ownership to Todd. I watched her process the secondary mortgage he extracted. I watched her reach the final page detailing the impending Friday balloon payment and the scheduled Saturday foreclosure auction. The reaction was not what I expected. I braced for denial. I prepared for a dramatic outburst or a sudden flare of rage directed at the son-in-law who had robbed her. Instead, she broke in silence. Her shoulders caved inward. The rigid posture she maintained for decades collapsed, leaving an exhausted, fragile old woman staring at a stack of undeniable truth. She traced the edge of the county seal with a trembling finger. She realized she had handed the heart of our family history to a thief out of blind, misplaced love. I waited for the apology. I waited for her to acknowledge that the daughter she treated like a blue-collar disappointment was the only person sitting at the table trying to stop the bleeding. Brenda looked up from the papers. Her eyes were red and swimming with fresh tears. She reached across the table and grasped my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You cannot show this to anyone, Mila." She whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "You cannot expose him." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer irrationality of her request. I asked her why we should protect a man who was actively selling her father's legacy to cover a failing wine business. "It will destroy Vanessa," she pleaded, leaning closer. "It will ruin her marriage, and it will destroy her reputation in Traverse City. We cannot let that happen. You have the resources, Mila. You can pay the $10,000 to satisfy his fake eviction notice. You can quietly pay off the balloon payment on the cabin. We can keep the property safe and let Todd walk away without a scandal. Please protect this family for once, instead of insisting on being right." The sickness that washed over me was profound. She was asking me to finance my own manipulation. She wanted me to absorb a 6-figure fraud, eat the cost of the stolen equity, and allow the thief to retain his seat at the head of the Sunday dinner table. She wanted me to subsidize the pristine portrait of her golden child. If I refused her demand, I knew exactly how the narrative would spin. I would fulfill the prophecy Todd outlined in his blackmail text. I would become the greedy, unfeeling sister who evicted her own mother and tore the family apart over money. I gently pulled my wrist out of her grasp. I gathered the certified documents and slid them back into my briefcase. I stood up from the booth, looking down at the woman who would rather sacrifice my hard-earned capital than face the reality of her favored daughter's ruined life. I told her I needed time to think, and I walked out of the diner into the freezing Detroit rain. I drove back to my logistics center and locked myself inside my glass-walled office. I spent the afternoon reviewing freight manifests and routing schedules, focusing on the predictable logic of supply chains to keep my mind from spiraling. Around 3 o'clock, the dynamic shifted again. Todd, possessing the predatory instinct of a cornered animal, sensed that my earlier decoy text was a genuine sign of weakness. He called Brenda and fed her a strategic lie. He told her that he had successfully negotiated with me. He claimed I had caved to his pressure and agreed to sign the Royal Oak apartment building over to the family trust. Brenda, desperate to believe that her golden son-in-law had fixed the crisis, accepted his lie as gospel. The aunts and uncles quickly received the joyous news through the family grapevine. But Brenda knew me well enough to understand that I do not surrender assets without a fight. A deep paranoia took hold of her. She panicked, assuming I would change my mind and back out of the phantom agreement before the paperwork was finalized. She decided to use public humiliation to lock me into the corner Todd had built. By 6 o'clock, my cell phone turned into a live grenade. The notifications arrived in a rapid, relentless volley. Brenda had logged into the private Michigan family social media group and posted a tearful 1,000-word manifesto. She tagged 50 different relatives, stretching from Detroit all the way up to the Upper Peninsula. I opened the application and read the digital wreckage. She named my logistics company. She named me. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a wealthy corporate executive attempting to squeeze rent from her own flesh and blood. She claimed I was the ruthless predator, sending fake eviction notices, and that the family fundraising campaign was her only lifeline against my unmatched cruelty. She framed Todd as the heroic mediator, trying to force me to do the right thing. The comments beneath her post were a brutal execution of my character. Cousins I had played tag with as a child called me a heartless monster. Aunts who used to send me birthday cards accused me of forgetting where I came from. The most chilling comment came from an uncle who worked as a heavy machine operator. He typed out a vivid threat promising to drive his pickup truck through the loading dock doors of my warehouse to teach me a lesson about family loyalty. This was the true rock bottom. The pain did not stem from the insults or the physical threats. The agonizing grief came from the sudden, stark realization that the reconciliation I had chased for my entire life was now scientifically impossible. Whatever move I made next, the outcome was fixed. If I paid the ransom and saved the cabin, I would forever be the subjugated bank account, bullied into submission by public shaming. If I exposed the fraud and fought back, I would forever be the traitor who humiliated the matriarch and destroyed Vanessa's marriage. There was no scenario where I emerged as the beloved daughter. There was no path that led to Brenda looking at me with pride. I sat alone in the dark warehouse long after the administrative staff had gone home for the evening. The only illumination came from the amber glow of the security monitors and the harsh white light of my cell phone screen displaying the endless stream of family hatred. Aunt Diane's words from years ago echoed in the cavernous silence of the office. Winning an argument with your mother is not the same thing as winning her. I finally understood the profound gravity of that warning. I was never going to win her. The yellow sticky note I had attached to her lease, the promise of locked rent and a safe harbor, was a foolish fantasy. I had spent 2 decades building an empire to buy a ticket to a theater that had burned down before I was even born. The lie I had nurtured since childhood quietly expired in that dark room. The desperate hope that I could earn my mother's love through achievement or financial rescue died an unceremonious death. The passing of that lie hurt more than the forged documents, more than the stolen equity, and more than the digital mob demanding my head. It felt like an organ failing, but as the grief washed over me, it scrubbed away the lingering, desperate need for her approval. The fear of being the bad guy vanished. I no longer needed to protect a family portrait that featured everyone but me. The truth was the only thing left, and tomorrow the audit would demand a reckoning. The sun rose over the industrial park, casting long gray shadows across the concrete loading bays. Inside my glass-walled office, my cell phone continued to light up with notifications. The social media mob had been working tirelessly through the night. Dozens of cousins and distant relatives were leaving blistering comments under my mother's fabricated manifesto. They called me greedy. They called me a traitor. They promised to make me pay for attempting to throw a helpless widow onto the freezing streets. I watched the screen illuminate and fade. I did not type a single reply. I did not draft a defense or issue a denial. My silence was no longer a strategic maneuver designed to draw out an opponent. It was born of pure, crystalline clarity. The desperate child who wanted to be seen and loved had vanished, leaving behind an executive who understood the mechanics of a failing system. I drank my black coffee and listened to the rhythmic hum of the forklifts operating on the floor below me. The noise was grounding. It was the sound of honest labor. I spent the morning reviewing freight manifests and adjusting shipping routes. The digital hatred directed at me felt distant, like a storm raging on the other side of a thick glass window. I had accepted the loss of my mother. That acceptance brought a strange, tranquil power. At exactly noon, the heavy steel door of my logistics office swung open with a resounding crash. The door slammed against the cinder block wall, rattling the framed safety certificates hanging nearby. Aunt Diane marched into the room. She bypassed the reception area entirely. She wore her faded denim jacket, and her boots hit the concrete floor with heavy, purposeful strikes. Her face was flushed dark red with betrayal and exhaustion. Diane stopped in front of my metal desk and dropped her heavy leather purse onto the surface. The thud echoed in the quiet office. She leaned forward, placing both hands on the edge of the desk. Her eyes were sharp and filled with a deep, weary disappointment. "Tell me you are not squeezing your own mother while the rest of us drain our pensions," she demanded. Her voice was rough, carrying the weight of 30 years spent fighting for assembly line workers. "Tell me you did not send that eviction notice, Mila. People are emptying their savings accounts today to save her. I need to hear you say this is a lie." I looked up at the woman who had always spoken the truth, even when it was unpopular. I did not offer a defensive speech. I did not raise my voice to match her anger. I reached into my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder I had assembled the day before. I placed it squarely between us on the desk. "Read it, Diane," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Diane eyed the folder suspiciously, but her union-trained instincts took over. She opened the cover and began to examine the documents. I watched her eyes scan the pages. She looked at the official lease agreement bearing my signature, locking the rental rate for the next 5 years. She examined the payment portal ledger, highlighting the monthly transfers flowing directly from the corporate account registered to Todd and Vanessa. She saw that Brenda had never missed a payment. She saw that the rent had never increased. She saw that the ruthless Chicago hedge fund was a phantom. Then she reached the third document. She pulled out the scanned copy of the forged eviction notice. Diane stared at the threatening language and the bold typography. She scrutinized the header and the signature block. I watched a sudden sharp recognition flash across her face. She picked up the paper and held it closer to the overhead light. "Mila," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This font, the spacing on this letterhead, the way the margins align at the bottom." She looked at me, and the grief in her eyes hardened into raw iron. "It is Todd's wine club invoice," she stated. "He sent me a promotional bill for a holiday wine shipment last Christmas. It looked exactly like a cheap collection notice. The template is identical. He just swapped the logo." The seed planted during that dinner in Birmingham bloomed in her hands. Todd had used his own failing business software to generate the fake legal threat. He was arrogant enough to assume working-class people would never notice the formatting of a corporate document. I reached into the folder and pulled out the final piece of paper. I handed her the certified county title search for the property in the Upper Peninsula. "Look at the date on the secondary mortgage, Diane," I instructed. She took the paper. Her eyes tracked the recorded liens. The color drained from her face. She sank into the chair opposite my desk. The fight left her posture replaced by a cold, sickening horror. "He mortgaged your grandfather's house," she breathed. "He took out a loan against the cabin. The balloon payment is due tomorrow," I added. "If that note is not paid, the bank sends the cabin to a public foreclosure auction on Saturday morning." Diane sat in stunned silence. The reality of the theft settled over the room. The family had been mobilized to save a rented apartment that was never in danger, while the true legacy built by our grandfather's hands was being sold off to cover a fraudulent debt. "What do we do?" she asked. Her voice was stripped of its previous anger. She was asking for direction from the only person in the room who had the entire map. At that exact moment, the true pivot of the story occurred. It was not a shift in strategy. It was a fundamental shift in my own soul. For 20 years, every action I took regarding my family was fueled by a burning desire to prove my worth to Brenda. I wanted to punish those who dismissed me and force them to acknowledge my success. But looking at Diane holding the proof of our shared history being stolen, I realized the desire for revenge had vanished. I no longer wanted to punish my mother. I no longer cared if she ever clapped for my achievements or recognized my value. The truth finally arrived in the quiet space of my office. My worth was never hers to grant. I had built it myself, pallet by pallet, contract by contract. My motivation clarified into something pure and undeniable. I wanted to make the honest working people whole again. I wanted to return the stolen overtime pay to the cousins who skipped groceries to fund a lie. I wanted to secure the cabin my grandfather built. I wanted to stop Todd from victimizing anyone else. I was going to do it because it was simply the right thing to do, full stop, regardless of whether my mother ever loved me for it. "I need you to gather everyone, Diane," I said, breaking the silence. "Call every single relative who donated to that campaign. Tell them there is an emergency family meeting tonight." "Where are we meeting?" she asked, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Here," I replied. "Bring them to the warehouse at 7 o'clock. Diane frowned, looking around the industrial office. "Why here, Mila? Why not rent a hall or go to Brenda's place?" "Because this is my ground," I said. "Because this is the fortress built by the useless daughter. They need to see exactly where the truth lives." I stood up and looked out the window at the loading docks below. The semi-trucks were lined up in perfect order, ready for dispatch. I thought about the thousands of miles of highway those trucks would cover by morning. I thought about the logistics required to keep everything moving. And because the foreclosure auction is 36 hours away, I continued. The clock is ticking, and it is the loudest thing in the room right now. We do not have time for living room pleasantries. Bring them here. Diane nodded. The seasoned union representative understood the necessity of controlling the environment during a critical negotiation. She folded the forged eviction notice and placed it back inside the manila envelope. She stood up and slung her purse over her shoulder. The despair had vanished from her expression, replaced by a grim, unwavering resolve. She was ready to go to war for her family. I will make the calls she promised. I will tell them it is a matter of life and death for the family fund. They will show up. She turned and walked out of the office, closing the steel door behind her with a soft click. The sound was final. The preparations were complete. I sat back down at my desk and opened my laptop. I had one final logistical maneuver to execute before the sun went down. The confrontation was coming to my territory, and I intended to orchestrate the outcome with the same precision I applied to my global supply chains. The long chapter of hiding and hoping was over. The era of undeniable proof was about to begin. At 7 o'clock that evening, the cavernous main bay of my distribution center was transformed. I had directed the forklift operators to clear a central staging area, creating a massive open square surrounded by towering racks of shrink-wrapped cargo. The sheer scale of the space was intended to remind everyone exactly where they were standing. This was not a cozy living room designed for soft lies. This was an industrial engine of commerce built on hard facts and measurable outputs. 30 members of my extended family stood huddled in the center of the concrete floor. They wore heavy winter coats and work boots, shifting uncomfortably under the harsh halogen lighting. Aunt Diane had delivered on her promise. Every single cousin, uncle, and second aunt who had contributed to the fraudulent fundraising campaign was present. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension and the smell of diesel exhaust. They glared at me with expressions ranging from deep confusion to outright hostility. They had been summoned here, believing they were about to witness the wealthy sister finally capitulate and surrender her assets to save the matriarch. I stood at the front of the assembly near a massive blank expanse of white drywall. I wore a simple black turtleneck and slacks. I held a small digital presentation remote in my right hand. The heavy steel entry doors groaned open and the final attendees arrived. Brenda walked in, flanked by Vanessa and Todd. My mother looked exhausted, but carried herself with a defiant, rigid posture. Vanessa walked beside her, eyes fixed firmly on the concrete floor, the sequined glamour of the Yacht Club replaced by a drab, oversized sweater. Todd led the procession. He strode into the warehouse with the confident swagger of a man arriving to collect his winnings. He wore a tailored wool topcoat and smiled broadly at the gathered relatives. He surveyed the towering pallets of freight and let out a low, appreciative whistle. He genuinely believed this entire gathering was a formal surrender ceremony orchestrated for his benefit. He stopped a few feet away from me, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. The smirk on his face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "We are willing to forgive you, Mila," he announced, his voice echoing loudly off the corrugated metal ceiling. He spoke to the crowd, but his eyes were locked on mine. "We understand that mistakes were made. If you just sign the building over to the family trust tonight, we can put this whole ugly eviction mess behind us and focus on saving Mom." I looked at the man who had mortgaged my grandfather's legacy and stolen from the line workers to fund a failing winery. I did not yell. I did not engage in a debate about forgiveness or family values. I simply pressed a button on the small remote in my hand. A high-powered industrial projector suspended from the steel rafters hummed to life. A blinding beam of light cut through the dim warehouse and struck the 60-foot white wall behind me. The image displayed was massive and undeniable. On the left side of the projection was a live screenshot of the Save Mom's Home fundraising campaign, showing the total amount raised, $40,000. On the right side of the projection was the official encrypted payment ledger for Brenda's apartment. The columns clearly showed her rent was locked at $2,000. The rows confirmed that every single monthly payment had been processed successfully on time without a single late fee or default. A collective sharp gasp swept through the 30 gathered relatives. The sound of 30 people simultaneously performing basic arithmetic filled the cold air. They stared at the 60-foot proof that the financial crisis did not exist. I pressed the button again. The image shifted. Now the wall displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the aggressive demand letter from Great Lakes Holdings LLC threatening immediate eviction. On the right was the promotional holiday invoice Todd had emailed to Aunt Diane for his boutique wine club. The identical typography, the exact same margin spacing the matching structural layout. The visual evidence of the forgery was absolute and undeniable. "Nobody is being evicted," I said, my voice steady and amplified perfectly by the acoustics of the industrial space. I did not raise the rent. The corporate hedge fund is a fiction created by the man standing in front of you. I swept my arm toward the towering projection on the wall. "You have all been robbed." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. The aunts and uncles who had emptied their modest savings accounts turned their gazes away from the wall and focused them entirely on Todd. The hostility that had been directed at me moments earlier pivoted, instantly seeking its true target. The collective fury of working-class people who had been swindled by a man wearing expensive shoes began to rise like a physical wave. Todd took a sudden step backward. His confident smirk collapsed into a mask of pure panic. He looked at the massive projection and then at the faces of the relatives closing in around him. He realized in a fraction of a second that the narrative he had carefully constructed over months had been obliterated by 2 slides on a warehouse wall. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie, to offer an excuse, but the words failed to materialize. Then the twist detonated, and the explosion did not come from me. It came from the person I least expected. Vanessa stepped out from behind our mother. She moved into the harsh light of the projector beam. She was shaking visibly, but her posture was no longer hunched or defeated. She carried a thick manila folder clutched tightly against her chest. She walked past Todd without looking at him and stopped right beside me. She turned to face the stunned family. She opened her folder and let the contents spill onto a nearby shipping crate. "He forged me too," she said, her voice ringing out clear and desperate in the quiet warehouse. The golden sister, the favored daughter, the woman who had spent her life performing perfection for our mother, pointed a trembling finger directly at her husband. "I've been documenting everything since March," she continued, the words spilling out in a rapid, panicked rush. "I found the equipment loan documents hidden in his home office. The signature on the federal bank drafts is not mine. He took out massive commercial debt in my name to cover the failing winery. When I confronted him, he threatened to ruin my credit and take the business entirely." She looked out at the sea of shocked faces, her eyes brimming with tears. She was terrified, but she was finally speaking the truth. "I was too scared to move alone," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I knew he was siphoning money from Mom, but he controlled all the accounts. I thought if I exposed him, he would destroy us both." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. The tidy hierarchy of villains was completely dismantled. The elegant, successful sister was not the architect of the fraud. She was the first hostage taken by the machine. She had been living inside a financial nightmare, performing for the family, while her husband slowly suffocated her business and stole her identity. Vanessa had just become my strongest witness. Her testimony corroborated the forgery and established a clear pattern of predatory behavior. The mood in the warehouse shifted from shock to absolute rage. The family turned on Todd as a single unified entity. Men who spent their days wrestling heavy machinery stepped forward, their hands balled into fists. Uncle Gary, a massive man who had retired from the stamping plant, moved with surprising speed. He positioned his large frame directly in front of the heavy steel exit door, blocking the only viable path out of the building. Todd realized he was surrounded. He bolted. He turned away from the projection and sprinted toward the exit, his expensive topcoat flapping behind him. He intended to run from the consequences of his actions. He made it exactly halfway across the concrete floor before he saw Uncle Gary blocking the exit. Gary crossed his arms over his chest and planted his feet wide, prepared for a physical confrontation. I did not let the situation devolve into violence. I am a strategist who checks security cameras instead of yelling. I manage complex supply chains by relying on documentation, not brute force. I maintain order. Let him go. I commanded, raising my hand high in the air. My voice cut through the rising chaos, stopping Gary in his tracks. The entire warehouse turned to look at me. Gary frowned, his fists still clenched. "Mila, he stole from us." Gary argued, his voice rough with anger. "You cannot just let him walk out that door. We do not need a door, Gary," I replied, lowering my hand and gesturing toward the massive projection on the wall. "We have paper. We have the digital trail. We have the forged lease, the intercepted mail, and Vanessa's commercial loan documents." I looked directly at Todd, who was frozen in the middle of the floor, trapped between the angry family and the blocked exit. Running from a documented federal wire fraud case is significantly worse than facing it, I informed him coldly. "You cannot outrun a paper trail, Todd. The evidence is already secure." Todd stood perfectly still. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He was a man who relied entirely on manipulation and social pressure to survive. He had no defense against certified bank records and sworn witness testimony. He realized that bolting through the door would only trigger a massive manhunt and elevate his crimes from civil fraud to a federal flight risk. He was completely trapped by his own paperwork. Vanessa refused to look at him. She stared straight ahead, her jaw set, her hands gripping the edge of the shipping crate. She had finally chosen the brutal truth over the pristine family portrait. Brenda watched the entire scene unfold with a look of absolute horror. The matriarch, who had spent decades orchestrating family dynamics, manipulating affections, and choosing favorites, finally comprehended the true cost of her actions. She saw her golden son-in-law exposed as a predatory thief. She saw her favored daughter, broken and terrified, standing beside the blue-collar sister, who had quietly built an empire capable of stopping the hemorrhage. The illusion she had sacrificed everything to protect was reduced to ashes on a warehouse floor. I looked at my watch. The digital numbers glowed brightly in the dim light. The confrontation was successful, but the primary objective was still unresolved. The clock read exactly 30 hours until the public foreclosure auction on my grandfather's cabin. The emotional reckoning was finished, but the tactical extraction was just beginning. The sudden intervention preventing Uncle Gary from physically confronting Todd broke the immediate tension, but the raw fury in the warehouse remained palpable. The 30 extended family members were practically vibrating with anger. The revelation of the stolen GoFundMe donations and the forged loan documents was too much for Brenda to process. The matriarch, whose entire identity was built on maintaining a flawless social facade, suddenly buckled. Her knees gave out, and she began a dramatic swoon toward the concrete floor. Aunt Diane, who had spent decades managing theatrical union negotiations, moved faster than anyone expected. She caught Brenda under the arms, halting the faint before it could fully register. Diane hauled her sister upright with a distinct lack of sympathy. "Save the performance, Brenda," Diane hissed, her voice echoing sharply. "We are dealing with facts now." I stood at the front of the room watching the dynamic shift. For 38 years, I had been the silent observer at the edge of the family circle. I was the rough edge, the logistical necessity, the daughter who managed freight, while others managed optics. Now I was the undisputed center of gravity. I raised my hand high into the cold air. The warehouse went completely silent again. The quiet girl was holding the floor, and everyone was listening. Todd stood frozen in the middle of the staging area. He looked like a man who had stepped onto a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable detonation. I lowered my hand and addressed him directly. My voice was calm, carrying the practiced authority I use when dismantling a hostile vendor contract. I did not want mindless vengeance. I wanted precise, calculated restitution. I aimed the punishment to exactly mirror the crimes he had committed. You used a forged legal document to terrorize this family. Todd, I began pointing to the massive projection on the wall behind me. You stole the identity of my registered agent to create a fake eviction notice. So tomorrow morning, you will be served with a real legal document. It will be notarized and it will be delivered by the specific attorney whose name you decided to borrow. I gestured to the edge of the crowd. Arthur Sterling, my corporate attorney, stepped forward from the shadows. He wore a sharp-tailored suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. He did not say a word. He simply offered Todd a polite professional nod. Todd stared at the lawyer, his face emptying of all remaining color. The phantom he had used to threaten my mother was now standing in the room, holding a brief that detailed multiple counts of wire fraud. You built a fake emergency fund because your boutique winery was failing. I continued shifting my focus to the stolen money. You manipulated working people into emptying their savings to cover your balloon payments. Therefore, the financial restitution mandated by the court will be paid by completely liquidating that winery. The business you committed federal fraud to protect is the exact asset that will be sold off to repay every single cousin and aunt in this room. I looked at Vanessa. She stood beside the shipping crate clutching her folder of evidence. She had spent her life presenting a polished image, but tonight she looked stripped down and undeniably real. The Golden Sister was now a cooperating witness. Her detailed documentation of the forged loan applications was the leverage that guaranteed Todd's compliance. Her testimony was the mechanism that made federal prison the only alternative to full and complete repayment. Vanessa met my gaze and offered a single sharp nod of agreement. Then we reached the final and most critical piece of the extraction, the timeline that had been driving my actions for the past 72 hours. You manipulated Brenda into signing a quitclaim deed, I said, my voice dropping to a hard, quiet register. You used that fraudulent deed to extract $150,000 of equity from the cabin my grandfather built. You mortgaged a piece of our family history, and you set it on a collision course with a Saturday morning foreclosure auction. I reached into my manila folder and pulled out a thick packet of certified banking documents. I placed the stack squarely onto the wooden pallet in front of me. This afternoon, I contacted the commercial lender holding that secondary mortgage I announced. I used my corporate capital to purchase the defaulted note entirely. I did not just pay off the arrears, Todd. I bought the debt. I own your loan now. The foreclosure auction is officially canceled. A profound collective gasp rippled through the gathered relatives. The relief was immediate and vocal. The tension that had gripped the room broke as the family realized the cabin was safe from the auction block. But I was not finished. Buying the debt was only the first half of the maneuver. I picked up a second document from the folder. It was a freshly minted property deed stamped with the county seal. As the new holder of the defaulted note, I executed a rapid restructuring of the collateral, I explained. And the deed to the cabin, I said, turning and sliding the heavy paper across the pallet toward Aunt Diane, goes directly into Diane's name tonight. It is being placed into an irrevocable trust managed by her. It is permanently, legally, and structurally out of your reach forever. I looked back at Todd. The arrogant man wearing expensive boat shoes was completely dismantled. You tried to steal the legacy my grandfather built with his own 2 hands, I told him. Instead, you lose everything you value by the exact same mechanism you used to try and take it. You are trapped by your own paperwork. Todd stared at the concrete floor, ruined. The sophisticated financial manipulation he believed made him untouchable was the very tool I used to strip him of his assets. The silence that followed was total. The extraction was complete. The fraudulent debts were neutralized and the stolen property was secured. Then Brenda made one last desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. She pulled away from Diane's grip and stepped forward, her voice rising in a frantic defensive wail. I did it for family survival, Mila. She cried out her hands, gesturing wildly toward Vanessa. You do not understand because you care more about your boxes and your trucks than your own blood. I was trying to protect my daughter. I watched her perform. I watched the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a blue-collar embarrassment try to use my success as a weapon against me. I waited for the familiar sting of rejection. I waited for the desperate need to defend myself to rise in my chest. It did not happen. For the first time in 38 years, her words simply failed to land. They slid off me like rain off a sealed loading dock. The emotional tether that had bound me to her approval had been severed in the diner earlier that day. You did it because you were told to by the man who was actively robbing you, Mom, I answered. My voice was devoid of heat, devoid of anger. It was merely a statement of fact. You chose to believe a lie because it was wrapped in an elegant package. I picked up my presentation remote and turned off the massive projector. The warehouse wall went dark. I am not angry anymore, Mom, I said, looking at her tired, panicked face. I am just done being your proof of anything. I am done auditioning for a role that was never meant for me. The retribution was absolute and structurally flawless. The punishment mirrored the crime perfectly. The false eviction notice resulted in a real legal summons. The stolen charity funds were replaced by the liquidation of the fraudulent business. The stolen property was reclaimed by buying the debt used to leverage it. It cost Todd precisely what he tried to steal, and it cost Brenda the illusion she had sacrificed everything to protect. The family meeting was over. The logistical nightmare had been untangled. Now the long, slow process of rebuilding the wreckage would begin. The heavy steel doors of the distribution center rolled shut, ending the long night. The roar of the engines from the adjacent highway faded into the distance. The confrontation was finished, but the logistical execution of the aftermath had just begun. I returned to my office and began drafting the parameters of the new reality. I did not evict my mother. Throwing her out onto the street would have fulfilled the exact prophecy Todd had drafted in his blackmail text. It would have transformed me into the ruthless corporate villain they needed me to be so they could play the victims. I operate in reality, not in melodrama. Instead, I engineered a legal fortress. I directed Arthur Sterling to transfer ownership of the 6-unit building into an irrevocable trust. I drew up a final lease agreement that froze Brenda's monthly rent for the remainder of her natural life. She would never have to worry about a market increase, a predatory landlord, or a changing economy. But that safety came with one ironclad addendum. The contract explicitly named Todd. He was permanently barred from the premises. If he set foot on the property, the trust would instantly dissolve the lease, and the protection would void. The clause was non-negotiable. Brenda was housed and secure, but more importantly, she was structurally isolated from the man who had turned her into a financial weapon. The trap she had feared became a sanctuary she could not break. Vanessa upheld her end of the bargain. The morning after the warehouse assembly, she sat in a sterile conference room with my legal team and handed over the digital folders containing months of screenshots, emails, and fabricated loan documents. Her cooperation provided the federal investigators with the exact leverage they required. Her testimony spared her from facing co-conspirator charges. She filed for divorce 3 days later. The golden sister stepped off the pedestal our mother had built for her and joined the real world. Today, Vanessa manages a tasting room for a vineyard owned by someone else up in Leelanau County. She earns an hourly wage plus commission. She wears sensible shoes and she pours wine for tourists. It is honest, hard labor. Her name is on nothing she did not build herself. When I hear updates about her through the family grapevine, people say she looks more vibrant now than she ever did wearing sequins at a yacht club. She lost the illusion of wealth, but she gained her own life. The frantic energy of trying to maintain a facade has been replaced by the quiet dignity of a person doing a fair day of work for a fair day of pay. The stolen fundraising money was not reversed overnight by a magic wand. Financial recovery in the real world is a slow, grinding process. The court ordered the liquidation of Todd and Vanessa Enterprise. The boutique cherry wine business was sold off piece by piece to satisfy the creditors and the defrauded relatives. The fermentation tanks, the bottling equipment, the delivery vans were all auctioned to the highest bidder. The proceeds trickled into a designated escrow account over the course of the spring. Aunt Diane took charge of the distribution. She sat at her kitchen table with a sprawling spreadsheet tracking every single dollar. She mailed physical checks to the line workers, the cousins, and the uncles who had pledged their overtime pay. I remember the day my cousin Sarah called me weeping with relief because her $200 check had arrived in the mail just in time to cover her utility bill. It took 7 months to make the family whole, but every working person received their stolen money back. Diane tracked the ledger with the same fierce dedication she used to audit union dues, ensuring the math was flawless. Todd did not attempt to fight the tidal wave of paper. On Monday morning, Arthur Sterling personally served him with the civil suit, while federal agents formally requested him for an interview regarding the wire fraud and forgery across state lines. Faced with Vanessa turning state evidence and my pristine audit trail, his arrogant facade crumbled. The man who wore boat shoes in the winter could not talk his way out of a federal indictment. He took a plea agreement to avoid the maximum sentencing guidelines. Part of the plea required him to surrender all remaining business assets and accept a lengthy probation term. He packed his belongings into a rented sedan and vanished from Michigan. He moved out west, fading into the kind of obscurity he'd spent his entire life trying to outrun. As for my grandfather's hand-built cabin in the Upper Peninsula, the crisis concluded with mere hours to spare. I finalized the purchase of the secondary mortgage note on Friday afternoon. The county clerk stamped the cancellation of the foreclosure auction on Saturday morning, just as the sun began to rise over the Great Lakes. The deed now sits safely in a lockbox under Aunt Diane's name. The timber and stone foundation remain in the family, protected by the very logistical maneuvering Brenda had so often ridiculed. The legacy was safe from the auction block and secured for the next generation. 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, I drove to Royal Oak. I carried the finalized trust documents and the lifetime lease in a plain manila folder. I walked up the stairs to Unit 4 and knocked on the door. The sound of the deadbolt turning was loud in the quiet hallway. Brenda opened the door. She wore a simple cardigan and looked 10 years older than the woman who had performed near the ice sculpture. The immaculate staging of her apartment felt hollow. The imitation brass fixtures lacked their usual shine. She invited me inside, but she did not offer coffee or tea. We stood in the entryway, the space between us vast and unbridgeable. The air in the apartment felt stale, as if the energy required to maintain the grand illusion had finally been depleted. I handed her the folder. I explained the terms of the trust. I told her the rent was frozen for life. I explained the addendum barring Todd from the property. I made sure she understood that her housing was guaranteed as long as she adhered to the perimeter I had established. She took the folder, holding it against her chest like a shield. She looked down at the hardwood floor, unable to meet my eyes. This was the moment I had spent my entire life anticipating. The final sit-down with the mother who had deemed me a blue-collar disappointment. I had the power, the leverage, and the undeniable proof of my worth. I could have demanded an apology. I could have listed every grievance from the past 20 years. I could have forced her to acknowledge that the forklift life she despised had ultimately been her salvation. Instead, I opted for simple, unvarnished honesty. I did not want to extract a forced confession. I only wanted to close the ledger on my own terms. I sent you a note that said you were safe. I told her, my voice steady and free of malice. I meant it then, Mom. It is still true. You have a home here for the rest of your life. I paused, watching her shoulders rise and fall with a shallow breath. The silence stretched out, filling the narrow entryway. I am just not waiting by the phone anymore, I said. Brenda had nothing to say. She stood in the foyer of her secured apartment, clutching the paperwork that guaranteed her survival. She did not offer a tearful reconciliation. She did not express gratitude or remorse. She remained entirely silent, looking at the documents that represented the end of our old dynamic. For the first time in 38 years, her silence did not wound me. The familiar ache in my chest was gone. The frantic child running on the loading dock, hoping to be seen, had finally stopped running. I looked at the woman standing in front of me and realized I no longer needed her validation to justify my existence. I had built something real out of the useless years. I had constructed a logistics empire, salvaged a family from financial ruin, and secured a legacy built by my grandfather's calloused hands. Brenda could keep her opinion of me. She could hold on to whatever narrative made her comfortable. Her judgments were no longer the currency I used to measure my life. I no longer needed to buy her approval back. I turned the handle of the front door and walked out into the hallway. I did not look over my shoulder as the door clicked shut behind me. The air outside felt crisp and clear. I walked down the stairs and out to my car, leaving the heavy baggage of the past 2 decades locked behind a door I no longer needed to open. The audit was finished, and the road ahead belonged entirely to me. 2 years have passed since the doors of my distribution center rolled shut on that chaotic night. The cycle of the calendar brings a specific kind of clarity. March arrived again, bringing the bitter Michigan chill and the anniversary of the steakhouse dinner. A notification illuminated my phone screen early one Tuesday. It was a group message from an aunt proposing a family gathering at that same Birmingham restaurant with the dim lighting and the exorbitant menu. 2 years ago, I sat in that exact booth and allowed my fingers to tremble while I paid an $800 bill. I thought about the power dynamic. I considered reserving a table directly next to theirs. I thought about walking into the dining room wearing a custom-tailored suit and ordering an expensive bottle of wine just to prove my dominance. I thought about demonstrating my financial superiority in front of the woman who called my career a blue-collar embarrassment. But grand theatrical gestures are for people who still care about the audience. I deleted the message. I did not type a polite excuse. I did not send regrets. I simply chose not to attend. Sitting at my kitchen island, I experienced a distinct physical sensation. It was the precise feeling of pulling a deep wooden splinter out of your palm, the sudden absence of a dull, constant ache. A profound relief washed over me. I spent that evening reviewing upcoming freight schedules and drinking ginger ale in the quiet comfort of my own home. The silence in my house was earned. The Royal Oak apartment complex proved to be a highly lucrative investment. The Detroit metropolitan real estate market surged over the next 24 months. The property value appreciated by 50%. My financial advisor called a meeting to urge me to sell. He presented a detailed spreadsheet highlighting a highly profitable exit strategy. He told me the market was peaking and holding the asset was a missed opportunity. I declined his advice. I did not purchase that brick structure to flip it for a quick return. The building was secure, and the lifetime lease protected the tenant in Unit 4. Instead of selling, I visited my commercial lender and extracted the newly generated equity. I funneled that capital into a dedicated trust. I established a vocational scholarship fund designed specifically for working-class high school graduates in the Detroit area. I targeted the students who want to enter the logistics and trade industries. I wanted to fund the kids who spend their winters working on freezing loading docks, the kids who wear heavy canvas jackets and steel-toed boots to pay for night classes. I named the foundation after my father. I thought about the man who used to drink Vernors on the porch after my grueling night shifts. I remembered him looking at a tired 12-year-old girl and promising her she would always land on her feet. He recognized the true value of calloused hands and a strong work ethic. Now his name provides tuition for trade schools and supply chain management certification programs. The legacy of grit is officially funded and operating. The true measure of our recovery revealed itself in the middle of the summer. The 4th of July weekend arrived with a wave of humid heat across the state. I drove north on Interstate 75, leaving the industrial sprawl of the Motor City behind. The landscape shifted to dense pine forests and the crisp scent of fresh water. My destination was the rustic cabin in the Upper Peninsula. The structure my grandfather built by hand stood tall and proud against the tree line. Aunt Diane held the deeds securely in her name. The property was safe from predatory loans and deceptive relatives. I parked my truck and walked toward the backyard. The smell of charcoal and roasting hot dogs filled the air. The relatives who had been swindled and made whole were gathered around picnic tables. The cousins who had donated their hard-earned overtime pay were drinking cheap beer and sharing stories. The stolen funds had been returned down to the last cent. Uncle Gary was manning the grill, flipping burgers with a spatula and arguing about the Detroit Tigers bullpen. The atmosphere was loud and joyful and entirely unpretentious. Then I saw Vanessa. She stood near the edge of the water wearing denim shorts and a faded cotton shirt. She threw her head back and let out a loud, unrestrained laugh. It was a joyful sound I had never heard in all our years growing up together. The rigid posture and the forced yacht club smile were gone. The heavy burden of performing elegance for our mother had lifted from her shoulders. She looked genuinely happy. She manages a tasting room for a vineyard owned by someone else now. She takes home a steady paycheck and owns her own life. She's doing honest work and putting her name on nothing she did not earn. The contrast between this dirt-stained celebration and the sterile country club galas of the past was sharp and beautiful. We exchanged a smile from across the yard, a bridge built on mutual survival rather than forced sisterhood. I stepped away from the crowded yard and walked up the wooden stairs to the wraparound porch. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the Great Lakes, casting a deep orange glow across the rippling water. I carried 2 cold cans of Verner's ginger ale. I popped the tab on the first can and took a long sip. The sharp carbonation hit the back of my throat. I placed the second unopened can resting on the wooden railing facing the lake. It was a quiet tribute to the man who taught me how to survive the concrete. I leaned against the wooden post and let the evening breeze hit my face. I realized something profound in that quiet moment. Brenda was not here. She was not invited to the holiday gathering. More importantly, I realized I had spent the entire afternoon without feeling her absence. The desperate longing for her presence had finally evaporated. I knew exactly where she was. She was sitting in her secure apartment in Royal Oak, drinking tea and telling her social circle that her youngest daughter was a bitter disappointment. She was spinning tales about my lack of grace and my blue-collar sensibilities. She was likely telling the neighbors that I cared more about boxes and trucks than my own blood. I let her keep the story. I let her hold on to the narrative that made her feel superior. That narrative used to define my entire existence. The useless daughter and the golden sister were the roles assigned to us by a mother who viewed love as a scarce commodity to be hoarded and rationed. I spent 20 years trying to overturn her verdict. I built a corporate logistics firm and accumulated wealth just to file an appeal in the court of her opinion. But standing on the porch of my grandfather's cabin looking out over the water, I understood the ultimate truth. The verdict was never mine to win. A life spent appealing a rigged decision is a life spent trapped inside a courtroom instead of standing on a porch watching the sunset. I am done arguing my case. I built a logistics empire. I saved my family from financial ruin. I kept a piece of our history safe from the auction block. And most importantly, I finally set down the heaviest piece of cargo I ever carried. I set down the desperate need for my mother to see me. I see me. I know the exact value of the hands that route the freight and sign the contracts. That realization turned out to be more than enough. The noise from the cheap seats is still out there echoing in a luxury apartment down in the city. I just cannot hear it over the sound of the lake. Looking back at the timeline, the journey from a freezing Detroit warehouse to a peaceful summer evening on the lake represents a fundamental shift in my existence. I spent the majority of my youth attempting to decode the rules of a rigged game, hoping to somehow win a prize that was never actually offered to me. Today, I no longer play games. I manage realities. Through the wreckage of the fraud and the slow, deliberate recovery of my family, I extracted 5 distinct principles. These are not philosophies built on wishful thinking, but on the cold, hard reality of survival. First, I learned that paper never lies, but people always will. When someone demands your loyalty, your time, or your capital, you must demand the receipts. A signature, a digital ledger, or a certified deed will always tell you the truth that theatrical tears are designed to hide. Always track the supply chain of the deception. Second, I discovered that you can never purchase genuine affection. You can buy a luxury apartment building and you can freeze a lease for the rest of a natural life, but you cannot buy the approval of a parent who refuses to recognize your inherent value. Attempting to purchase love only bankrupts your spirit and empowers the individuals exploiting your desperate hope. Third, I realized that the loudest victim in any room is frequently acting as a decoy. While my mother was weeping loudly about a fictional corporate entity, a thief was quietly extracting the equity from our family history. When the emotional performance is blindingly bright, you must look closely at the dark spaces to see who is actually controlling the finances and moving the assets. Fourth, I learned that true power does not come from engaging your opponent in a screaming match. True leverage is the ability to walk away from the negotiation table entirely. I did not need to trade insults to dismantle the extortion attempt. I simply severed their access to my resources. A calm refusal to participate in toxic drama is the most devastating response you can possibly deliver. Fifth, and most importantly, I finally accepted that your worth is never granted by the people who underestimated you. It is constructed entirely by your own 2 hands. The dirt on my work boots and the late nights on the loading dock were never a source of embarrassment. They were the concrete foundation of a logistics empire. You do not need anyone else to validate the fortress you built yourself. I sit on the porch listening to the gentle rhythm of the water against the shore. The sun dips below the horizon, taking the last lingering remnants of the old shadows with it. The logistics of my life are finally in perfect order. The valuable cargo is secured and the dead weight has been permanently jettisoned. I'm no longer checking the tracking number on a delivery that was never shipped. I have everything I require right here in my own hands. If you are currently carrying the heavy burden of a family that only values what they can extract from you, I want you to set that weight down today. You do not owe your hard-earned success to the individuals who mocked your initial struggle. Share your own experiences with setting firm boundaries and reclaiming your peace in the comments below. Tell us how you stopped funding the toxic narratives in your own life. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Ariana Revenger for more stories about women who stop pleading for a seat at the table and start building their own empire.